Dear colleagues, I think we shall start now, and the others will follow us, because we need to be in time. We need to keep the schedule, because a lot of things will be held today. And the program is quite pressed, quite full of different things. As a tradition, we start with the conference, 2 sessions of the conference, morning session, daytime session, and then after a little interval, there will be a short musical video film, and then there will be online literary readings with 4 contemporary Irish writers, and that will be followed by offline parts of our today's virtual Bloomsday with our partners from the Art Square Art Gallery. Now to start our second virtual Bloomsday in history, I want to pass word to His Excellency, Ambassador of Ireland to the Russian Federation, Brian McElduff, as a tradition already, and I hope that Ambassador will greet all of us and start the conference.
Hello, good morning, Andre. Good afternoon to anybody further to the east. I heard that there are some guests from Tokyo, so we're really spanning the globe. This is the conference on which the sun never sets. I think we can say that. So thank you, Andre, for arranging such an ambitious program again. I hope it all goes well. It's 9 o'clock in the morning here in South Dublin. I just had my breakfast. Not kidneys, really. I don't really like kidneys very much, but it was a very fine, traditional Irish breakfast. Some very important information for you, which is that I returned on the direct flight from Moscow to Dublin, which has just been resumed, even though there was no official announcement. But that really will make a big difference to the embassy and to others. It makes life a lot easier that we can return so easily. So the weather here isn't especially nice. It's been very nice the last few days, but we always celebrate Bloomsday in Dublin. It's compulsory. We didn't, we always celebrated it in my family, and I grew up quite close to here. I'm actually staying not in a splendid palace, but in a mansion which is converted to the Radisson Hotel called St. Helens. It's a very beautiful house actually, and very nice grounds. But Bloomsday was my sister's birthday, which is why we always celebrated it, because my mother would not have tolerated James Joyce. She was from a very conservative family indeed. But I'm not too far from Sandymount Strand, so I do intend to go for a nice walk that way later, even if it's a little bit grey, as it so often is in Dublin. And I'll have a look at the very nice houses and very expensive houses and think about buying one of them one day from all the savings I've made in Moscow. So that's an ambition. It's still a little bit suboptimal, let's say, to use an Americanism, to do things by video conference, but we're reasonably optimistic about the future. So at least I'm going to get vaccinated here, which is one of the reasons I came back next week. And we think there is some light at the end of the tunnel. Certainly, I think we've used the last year to reflect on what we do, especially in the cultural field. And we have decided to be much more ambitious in the future. First of all, we will have extra staff in the embassy, which is always very helpful. I think we will get some extra resources because, one, we're looking at the all-important centenary of Ulysses next year, and it's not too early to start thinking about that. But also we're focused on 2023, the 50th anniversary of diplomatic relations between Dublin and Moscow. So you can trust that I'm thinking very seriously about that, because I'm pretty sure I'm going to still be in Moscow apart from anything else. And we do treat this pretty seriously. We're actually focusing more and more on culture, partly because in other areas of interest, it's become quite difficult to cooperate with Russia, very regretfully. So it makes sense to focus on culture. I know I've spoken about lots of things before, and you think, well, he never does anything, he just makes promises. But I would like to see Irish studies being formally revived with full support. I think it's fun that we can send you books, and I hope you got the books. Daria told me that they had been sent in a special truck to St. Petersburg.
Several trucks.
Books are the easy part. We really need to give you more support, and I think do things in a very structured way. And I think I know. I still remember Dr. Niall Keogh, who did such a fantastic job as a historian, and history is interesting, but we need to also think about literature and not just Joyce, but contemporary modern literature as well. So just on that, great that I could join you. I can stay with you at least for the opening session, after which I have to go and meet some relatives who demand to see me, who demand my presence. And you know, I hope the day goes very well, and I hope to see you actually physically in person before too long, once I've been vaccinated and I'm safe to travel. So again, Andre, thank you again, and all the best for the day.
Thank you very much, Ambassador, for these kind, encouraging words and for your help. And I want also to stress that these several trucks of books already came, and the books are very important for us. It was a very generous assistance for Bloomsday, so thank you especially for that. Now, I want to pass the word to Vice-Rector for International Cooperation of the Herzen State Pedagogical University, Professor Yulia Komarova. Again, another our traditional start of the conference as last year. Yulia Alexandrovna, please.
Thank you, Andrei, very much. Dear friends, I'm happy to greet you here in the second virtual Bloomsday in history. And again, I'm delighted to note that it's a wonderful, positive symbol of our Irish-Russian cultural and human friendship in these hard epidemic times and in these hard epidemic 2 years, as well as our deeply rooted cooperation. As a tradition of rather long tradition, which is more than 15 years, today's festival of Irish culture begins with the international conference, Ireland and Russia, past and present. It means that this year we'll have an anniversary conference annually organized in St. Petersburg. Before it was organized on the basis of State University, and just now here at Herzen University. And I'm happy to say that we organized this conference with our good friends from Cork. Hello, Cork. In the last 3 years, the center became a part of our friendly academic family. Well, I'm very glad to note that in spite of all the difficulties in our countries and their educational systems, such as online events, as today's conference prove, that true friendship and bright cultural cooperation can overcome all problems and give us hope for the future. I like this very old song, "We Shall Overcome." Yes, well, we will overcome, definitely. Today's festival comprises not only conference part, this is very essential, but also literary readings by contemporary Irish writers and enchanting Irish harp music in the new video film, and I believe that such a diversity of various interesting cultural events held in one day makes its program unique and uniquely suitable for people of different age, of different tastes, and of different interests. This is also very important. The larger our family is, the better for us. On behalf of Herzen University, I want to thank all those involved in Russia, Ireland, and other countries who made this festival possible. And also I want to especially thank Ambassador of Ireland, Mr. McElduff, for his changeless help. Special thanks to him. Support and friendly cooperation with our university and Irish Cultural Center. And for generous Bloomsday donation of books for the needs of our students and academics. I'm sure that we'll have much more to be done together in the nearest future as soon as the epidemiological situation allows. And of course, I confirm that we'll be delighted and privileged to invite Mr. Ambassador and all participants of the virtual Bloomsday to hopefully celebrate the next one in the hospital halls of our university. I do hope that this will happen next year. Well, anyway, dear friends, happy Bloomsday and have a nice celebration. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Alexander, for this support, for these encouraging words. Now I want to pass word to Olga Koroleva, our true friend in the Committee of External Relations of St. Petersburg, who always help us in organizing and holding all our Irish events in the city.
Dear friends, let me send the warmest heartfelt greetings from the Committee for External Relations and in particular from Chairman Mr. Grigoriev. So the links with Ireland play a significant role in the cooperation of St. Petersburg with foreign states, and we are happy that thanks to the Irish Culture Center of St. Petersburg, and thanks in particular to Andrei Mashinyan and his team, to His Excellency Ambassador to the Herzen Pedagogical University, such interesting projects are annually implemented. And I'd like also to greet and thank all our friends from the Cork University, from other countries, from Japan, from Belgium, and we definitely look forward to new offline projects. The pandemic is a rather serious period in the history of all other countries, but I know that thanks to our true friendship links between the countries of Russia and Ireland, we do manage to hold so many interesting events. I also hope that the wonderful project of photo exhibitions kindly prepared by Claire Q and Nadia Anfalova will continue. So we look forward to their new exhibition as part of the cultural forum. And I would like to delay you any longer. I just want to wish you every success, new interesting discussions. And I would like to assure you that we will do our best to support you from our side in every possible way. Thank you ever so much and good luck, and wish you all the best with the conference and with other new projects. Thank you very much. Thank you, Andrei, in particular. I know how hard it's to gather so many good scientists from all over the world, but you do manage to keep those links going. Thank you so much, most wholeheartedly from myself personally, because I really value friendship with you. And thank you, the Embassy of Ireland, and in particular, Mr. McElduff. So wish you luck.
Thank you very much, Olga. Thank you for this support and for your kind words. We hope really that the situation will promote and we will gradually turn from just online events to hybrid events with online and offline parts, and then return to our real life and to our real cooperation. I want, before I pass word to our first speaker of the conference, I want to say a few words about today's events. So as I mentioned, the conference is the first part and it is divided into two sessions. So during this morning session, we'll have first 5 talks, and then after an interval from 2 to 3 o'clock, at 3 o'clock we gather together back, and there will be 5 more papers. We have, as last year, speakers from different countries. Again, this year it's Russia, Ireland, Belgium, and Japan. Friends who are specialists and colleagues who are specialists in Irish literature and Irish history, from medieval history to modern Irish literature. And I also want to emphasize that then after another interval in the evening, we'll have not a very long but intensive program with our friends, writers, contemporary writers from Ireland. And here I want to mention 2 things. First of all, Ambassador in his greeting mentioned that not only Joyce and the writers of this letter A of Irish history of literature are important for our Irish studies and our cooperation, but of course contemporary Irish writers are also a big matter of our interest, and that's why we are very privileged to get acquainted today with some of them, thanks to Ivor Walsh, our contact in the University College Cork, director of creative writing of this, our partner university. So he gathered together this group of writers, and 4 of them, and they will read abstracts from their works. Another important moment that I wanted to say, to mention, Olga in her greeting speech said that these St. Patrick's Day, we already had the experience of hybrid events when there was an exhibition of portraits of contemporary Russian and Irish writers, and these writers who we host today during our readings are the same writers that participated in this project. So here we have again a sort of continuity of our online and hybrid events. Well, friends, this is generally it. And one more thing, this short musical video film, it will be again linked to YouTube. We think that it's much better because the film will last for about 20 minutes and Zoom is not very well for broadcasting such kind of videos which last more than 3-4 minutes. Therefore, we will again, like last year, use the same pattern. We'll show the link, we'll go and watch the movie, then we'll gather together and we have some small discussion of this movie and then pass to the literary readings. Well, friends, and now we start our conference, anniversary 15th conference, Ireland and Russia, the past and the present, which started back in 2006, thanks to our good friends, Professor Dermot Keogh, head of the history department at that time of the University College Cork, who brought a wonderful range of specialists, of academics from UCC, and thanks to Tatiana Ponomaryova, director of the Nabokov Museum, who hosted this first conference. And since that time, this wonderful tradition of celebrating Bloomsday by this exchange of academic knowledge in the various fields of Irish-Russian connections, or merely Ireland and Russia in their history and literature, started, and today we have the 15th conference. Now I am pleased to pass the word to our first speaker. As the tradition says, we start from the historical approach, and today we have again a medievalist to start our conference. Last year it was Dr. Damien Brecken from Cork, and this year again our good friend Ksenia Kudenko, another wonderful medievalist who is now from Cork as well, but originally from St. Petersburg. I pass a word to Ksenia, and if you need screen demonstration, you can use it. It's already switched from our side.
Okay, so I start sharing the screen, I suppose. Share. Am I sharing anything? Can you see it?
It's in process. It's in process. It's loading.
Process.
Yes, now we can see it.
Now you see. Okay. Okay, and it's working for me as well. So you see when I'm changing slides as well.
Okay.
Okay, so you can see everything, right? Okay, good. So, the topic of the current presentation, as you can see displayed now on your screens, is the marginal space in medieval manuscripts. And I think that technically it is probably the furthest away from the topic of our today's celebration. On the other hand, I think that Joyce would particularly enjoy this talk, because what we're going to have a look at is how texts affect us, how we perceive texts, how sometimes the texts, the important texts that, for example, medieval copyists were copying in the manuscripts, can be suddenly permeated by the very mundane thoughts of the tribulations of our everyday life. And on the other hand, how let's say a particular text can trigger by association other texts that we know, and in this way that there is this some sort of libraries of macro texts existing in culture and accordingly in our minds. And this is pretty much what Ulysses is all about, and that was the main method of James Joyce, as you all know. And surprisingly, I think that many of the medieval scribes, they were in a way precursors of Leopold Bloom, because they actually allowed us to see how they interact with text and how text affect them on the margins of medieval manuscripts. So the study of marginalia is obviously part of medieval manuscript studies. Manuscript for us, like medieval historians or historical linguists, it is a treasure trove of information. Manuscripts here, like on the top, you can see it's the link for the YouTube video. And after my talk, I will copy paste it in the chat for you, probably, if you're interested to watch. It's a 6-minute video which reenact the production of a medieval manuscript. So, but even if you never watched such a video, I suppose you can probably guess that producing a manuscript was very costly, very time consuming, very effort consuming, and needed excellent experts and specialists in very particular disciplines. So the pictures that you can see on the screen now, those are precious shrines for the manuscripts, because they were venerated very similarly to the remains of saints or other valuable religious, pretty much semi-religious objects. And very often they were kept in, as you can see, lush shrines decorated by precious gemstones and so on, because of course they were very fragile. As you know, they were produced on a parchment. Parchment, it is the cow's skin. So they were very prone to humidity of the air, to other like physical damage, and for this reason they were protected. So first of all, for us now, when we analyze manuscripts, first of all, it is a precious, tangible artifact. There are various studies which are dedicated to the study of how the physical objects. So for example, now there are all sorts of chemical analysis of inks used by medieval scribes, and obviously of the way the books were bound, how the contents were arranged, what are the different hands of scribes which participated in the compilation of the manuscript. The second part of manuscript studies is probably most kind of lying on the surface and very clear for us. It is obviously the content. So it is editing of the texts that were copying in the manuscripts, textual analysis, literary analysis, historical analysis of those texts, and of the textual connections between various manuscripts, like cycles which are transmitted in various manuscripts, and the contexts of manuscripts produced, for example, by the same scribes or in the same scriptoria. And the third part, which is definitely still not a mainstream, neither in Celtic studies nor in continental medieval studies in general, but which, to my to my own delight, is currently increasing. It is the study of marginalia and the so-called mise-en-page. What we mean by mise-en-page and marginalia. So let's discuss the terminology first. Mise-en-page, it's the term which is in French. So if you speak French, you already guessed what it is. Literally, it is put on the page. So how things are arranged in the page. Here it is the corner of the kind of like a fragment of the corner of one of the pages from one of the most high status Irish manuscripts, which is YBL, Yellow Book of Lacan. And you can see clearly that there is a hierarchy of texts, which is featured by the hierarchy of scripts, by certain ways the scribe is arranging his material. Like, for example, I hope you can see the small kind of like cross which I'm using as a pointer, that certain titles are put in boxes, and obviously this fragment is written in a much smaller script than, for example, this text, which we would consider a principal text on the page. Another feature of the mise-en-page is the so-called interlinear glosses, which are now very popular in Celtic studies. There is a massive project just finished in the Maynooth University, which was specifically dedicated to interlinear glosses in the Latin manuscripts produced on the continent by Irish scribes. So what are interlinear glosses? Gloss as such is a comment. So when the copyist is copying a text, very often it would supply the text with a commentary of the most obscure parts of this text. And in this way, those commentaries are written in the interlinear space. And so you can see again the hierarchy of scripts, you can see the beautiful, very elaborated initials, because of course we already discussed manuscripts are very precious and hence they're heavily decorated. And those glosses were technically aimed at clarifying the meaning of the main text. Very similar to what, to be honest, in current book editing, a footnote is doing. Yeah, for example, if there is some realia in the fiction we're reading, like, I don't know, if we're reading like modern Turkish literature and some Turkish food is mentioned, the commentary would go to the footnote for us as for like Russian or English speaking readers to figure out what the author means by that. And that was similar in medieval manuscripts. So when something obscure was mentioned, it was the task of the scribe to clarify this information for the readers of the manuscripts he was copying. And sometimes we end up with something like this. This is the page from the 15th century manuscript Laurbrack, the speckled book. As you can see, the main text is very neat and in large letters and occupies the center of the page, while all the commentaries are written in this tiny, tiny subscript, both in the margins, so in the marginal space, so in the edges of the page, as well as between the lines. So what we are going to have a look at today is actually this space. So the edge as such. And sometimes the edge is used, as in this case, to put the commentaries, also known as, for us, like current readers, very similar to our footnotes. But what we are going to have a look at is at the personal marginalia. Because, okay, and okay, maybe I changed the slide too early. Yeah, I'll just say a couple of words of what we are going to have a look at. So the personal marginalia, because the manuscripts were obviously very expensive and very precious, and there was not a chance a scribe would have his own, let's say, notebook or like his own journal to write what he was experiencing. So they somehow regarded the marginal space very often as a totally separate space, as a space which has nothing to do with the main text and which could give them room to vent their hearts out or to write something down what they considered valuable and what they wanted to transmit. But we will have we'll have a more detailed discussion about it as the talk progresses. Before we begin, so we just discussed that one type of those so-called secondary texts, because, okay, speaking of terminology again, so the texts which are the primary aim of copying, they're called the primary text or the principal text, and they are of course highlighted by means of the mise en page. So they would be introduced by an elaborated initial. The script is very clear, very easy to read. The letters are technically bigger in size. And then what we have here is the so-called secondary text. So the principal text and secondary text. And secondary text has, how I classify it technically, has three main variations. So the first one, as I already have shown, those would be the commentaries, the so-called glosses, which clarify the already written text. The second type of text would be the visual text, the pictures. And the third type of text would be the personal commentaries, which do not comment on the principal text, which do not really interact with the principal text, and which just are kind of relaxed moments of copying, relaxed moments of scribing, and which give room for more creative self-expression for the authors of those manuscripts. So the study of marginalia started definitely not with the Celtic studies, where it is still a very, very marginal, and pardon me my burlesque, marginal area of the discipline. It started obviously in continental medieval studies, because people finally decided to figure out what is happening on the margins, what are all those pictures. And the main questions which were posed by the continental medievalists working with continental manuscripts, primarily German, French, Italian, Czech, how do marginal entries interact with the principal text? Are they independent or not? And as you can already guess, there are basically only two variants. It's either yes or no. Very often, and probably I think that's what people, even who do not work with medieval manuscripts, people know that marginalia of medieval manuscripts is very often grotesque. Like here you can see that there are going to be some you can see that it's a psalter created in England in the 14th century. So the principal text is very serious in its nature and very venerated. But on the margin, we see one of those very famous scenarios when knights and kings and priests are interacting with the snails, which obviously undermine the whole message of the text. And in these cases, like when we see that there is a knight which kind of ridicules the practice of praying because he's praying to the snail, or here there are two monkeys fighting as knights on the margin of the manuscript, while in the meantime, the initial, which is part of the principal text, portrays a very decent picture of the, I suppose, of the Holy Family. You can see Mary with Jesus. And then when we shift to the margins, we see this grotesque and this kind of a culture of the so-called mundus inversus in Latin. So the topsy-turvy world, the world which is absolutely in mishmash. On the other hand, even those grotesque pictures can interact with the principal text, like here, and this is why I started with remembering how the stream of consciousness of Leopold Bloom works in Ulysses, that, you remember, for example, in the chapter 8 in Lotus Eaters, that he walks in Dublin and he's constantly triggered. So he's thinking of his daily tasks, of his job, and then he sees horses and he starts thinking of horses. So he's carried away. And that's what pretty much happens with the illustrators as well. Like here you can see there is a certain prayer. It starts with Anima Nostra, so our soul is kind of invoking protector. Yes, so protector, like God the protector. I suppose it's also part of the Psalms. And because the scribe was somehow attracted by this word protector, he put this little scene on the margins that a man, a kind of curiously blue man, is running away. He's escaping from some monster who has, it's basically a head with legs, and this man is kind of pointing his hand to the word protector, showing that he's in a dangerous situation and he evokes the protection of the Lord. in a similar way. The initial portrays, I suppose, one probably a scene either from the Old Testament or from the hagiography, Lives of the Saints. Here a saint is beheaded by the warrior, and it is kind of the parody is given on the margin straight away, that there is a man kind of trying to punish a rabbit, and you can see that those two pictures absolutely mirror each other. So in Irish manuscripts, we don't have such lush, I'll skip that one because of the lack of time, but this picture was just given for the sort of appreciation, how in, for example, this is the manuscript which contains the quest for the Holy Grail from Bibliothèque Nationale Française. So it's a French manuscript, 343. You can see absolutely gorgeous illustrations, I think, up to the standard of the current book illustration. In Irish manuscripts, we don't have those. We don't really have those lushly illuminated manuscripts with, like, you know, golden details, very colored, very skillful in their production. We rarely have illustrations as such. What we have is very amateurish, if I may say so, pictures sometimes, but again, very rarely. And they would be on kind of this level. So that's, for example, the Ark of Noah portrayed on the margin of the story of the how Noah was building his ark. So when we are working with Irish manuscripts, it's definitely not pictures that attract our attentions, because there are almost none. What is interesting, apart from those glosses that comment on the main text, are the so-called personal remarks. And why I call this talk is that those remarks are the source for microhistory, is that they allow us to tentatively reconstruct the biography of those scribes who are most often than not totally anonymous, and as well as the current political environment, religious environment, their cultural milieu, the texts that they were reading, the things they were concerned about. And microhistory as such, it is a kind of school in the historical learning, which was the pioneered in 70s in Italy. And the pioneer of this investigation was the Italian historian Carlo Ginzburg. So microhistory is the reduced scale historical investigation in which a single event, or, like, let's say, a community, a village, a person, I don't know, yeah, I already said an event, a battle, for example. So a tiny kind of like happening in the world history is looked through the microscope, hence the name microhistory, because we take a tiny particle, as a scientist would take a cell, and we look at it in the microscope to see lots and lots of things which are which are enclosed in it. And we use this as a vehicle to a bigger picture, because it is the bigger picture seen through the small. So we recreate the macro history through the study of the individual, through the study of minor circumstances. And one of the main examples of this approach is Carlo Ginzburg's monograph, The Cheese and the Worms, because he reconstructed the life of a 16th century peasant, Italian miller and heretic Menocchio. And as you probably can already guess, we don't have really historical evidence for this kind of people. History documents royalties, history documents aristocracies, and that was the kind of mainstream in medieval history, to describe the big wars, to describe the ambitions of ruling dynasties. No one was describing little people, because the information about them is fragmentary. But microhistory as such embraces those lacunae in evidence and uses them as part of the narrative. And this is why those personal remarks in medieval Irish manuscripts are so precious for us, because they can be used as this fragmentary evidence in microhistorical research. So the personal marginal remarks were always present in Irish manuscripts. Basically, in chronological order, the manuscripts that we have, First of all, the earliest manuscripts, those would be Latin manuscripts produced on the continent by medieval Irish monks. And one of the most famous is St. Gall Princeton Grammar, compiled in, as you can see, in 850 in Switzerland, in the monastery of St. Gall, by the Irish scribes, who left us a plethora of personal remarks on the margins of this important grammatical treatise. The most famous one, and the one on which there are plenty of articles even in the newspapers and so on, is the marginalia in the ancient Irish script, in the so-called Ogham runic alphabet, which was used in Ireland before the Latin alphabet was brought together with Christianity. And what it says, it basically is the runic inscription of the Irish word lathert, which can be translated something as hangover or drunkenness, or as Irish scribes interpreted themselves, ale killing. So we can imagine that the young scribe was given the important task of copying the Latin grammar after a very eventful night in which more ale was drunk than probably his body could have tolerated. So this is one of the tribulations of the scribes. Then sometimes they give us assessments of the text they're copying. For example, here is the note, the appreciation of Virgil, and it says Magnus Poeta Virgilius fuit, so that Virgil was a great poet. And then there is a small, very shy note here in tiny, tiny script written in Irish that it is not easy besides. That although the scribe was totally sharing this point of view, he was also complaining that Virgil is not easy to read. Other examples of what we can, of those personal expressions of scribal attitude towards their work and conditions, very often you can see that they complain that they're cold. Of course, this is probably medieval scriptoria. Like if you ever were in medieval cathedral or in medieval monastery, it's all stone, so it's naturally very cold environment. Here the scribe is complaining that his hand is tired. That's also a very recurrent topic, because when you copy text all day, obviously your hand would be tired. They complain that it is dark. They also complain very often about other physical conditions, like health condition. They would complain that, like here, oh Holy Virgin, my chest, that they're sick, that they have headaches, or that they have cough, and so on. And another very famous topic of this of those complaints is the condition of the vellum. So they would always often curse their vellum, or like here that the scribe left us the note that his vellum is bad. As you can see, the vellum really has holes in it. So it was difficult to write text on less than a perfect manuscript. Not only marginal space is used to, as I said, vent the heart out, it can also be used for the scribe to write down the poems which he considers pretty, or which he just wants to transmit. And one of the earliest and prettiest examples of early Irish poetry in Old Irish is actually found on the margins on the manuscript, like this very famous poem, Beatrice, the wind tonight, it stirs up the waved sea, I do not fear the coursing of the Irish Sea by the fierce warriors of Lochlan. Lochlan, it is Scandinavia, so it is about the Viking invasion, which was happening in the 9th century in Ireland. Or in the same Princeton grammar, a very famous poem about the blackbirds, which is singing to the scribe, and the scribe composes or transmits the poem about the beauty of the singing of the blackbird. So we can see how it is, as I said, it is very, that's why I think Joyce would enjoy it, because we cannot stop our stream of consciousness. We might be scribes and we're copying Latin grammar, and at the same time, I don't know, we hear a bird singing and we get carried away with this, and we leave this note as an evidence of what we're experiencing, because I think that for people, it is important to leave some testimony about our existence, some sort of blueprint of what we're experiencing on the daily basis. And the very famous poem, which probably many of you know, the Pangurban, Pangorban, it's the name of the cat, something like the white fluffy one, so белый пушистик in Russian, something like this. And even this very famous poem about a poem of love and fondness for the cat that the monk has in his cell was written here on the margin of the Reichenau primer, again, which is a manuscript produced in the on the continent in one of the Irish clusters founded by Irish monks on the continent. And here it is. And again, you can see here is some important and very, very serious matter, some metrical tract or so. And here we see on the margin this playful and lovely poem, how a monk loves his cat and how the cat gives him like the joy every day of his kind of secluded life. So those were manuscripts produced on the continent, but of course it is the same with the manuscripts produced in the in Ireland in Irish language. So the manuscripts start being produced in Irish language starting from the 12th century and up to the 15th century, and those are the most important codices. And of course we have also a plethora of those marginal remarks in manuscripts produced in Ireland and written entirely in Irish as well. The already well known to us, I curse my vellum, again complaints about the vellum. This is a very imaginative one. Apparently the scribe pricked his finger with the quill and a drop of blood probably dropped on the manuscript, and he just wrote that here is blood of the finger of Mulachlan or Kianen. Another kind of category of those personal remark are the so-called probationis pennae, the probing of the pen. So when you start the new page with the totally new quill, you know how when we get a new pen, it will not start writing immediately. So we need to kind of like try to do some doodles with it to make the ink flowing, and they needed to do it as well, obviously. And like in this marginal remark, the scribe, his name is Shigreth, and he says that I am Shigreth at probing my pen on the margin of the book. But okay, I really took my sweet time, so I probably don't have much time to discuss the other personal remarks, but we will quickly wrap things up.
Yeah,
So,
I'm sorry, we are close to running out of time.
Yeah, no worries at all. So yeah, I literally have like 5 minutes left just to show you how we use it for the as personal remarks as a source for microhistory, is that sometimes the scribes would leave their names on the margins. Like this 15th century scribe, Murharibach Okundlish was his name, and he was the scribe who produced the most high status manuscripts in the 15th century. And you can see that he leaves us lots of information on the margins. So for example, here he states the name of the province where he is writing, and he mentions his teacher, Gila Isa Makfirvishi, and he mentions him again in this remark. So when we work as microhistorians, so to speak, we kind of accumulate all this information. So he gives us here the name of his teacher. Here he gives us some historical context for his writing, and obviously 15th century, it is a very turbulent time in Irish history. So he would document on the margins the deaths of current of lords and the reason of deaths. And you can see that he writes that he is writing in the 2nd year that the King of England came to Ireland. So I'll go quickly. Yeah, those are just the examples I wasn't planning to show anyway. And together with those, he would be the ones that I want to say, yeah, the very classical entries would be in which he would state the date, and that's what happened, like here, St. John's Day tonight, and we have bad news here because the the city was invaded. Or St. Patrick's Day tonight on Monday and Tuesday tomorrow. I'm writing this live below, and Muskregetira experiences disturbances. And for me, what it looks really like diary entries, how we would put the date and the time of writing and then state what actually happened to us in this day. And you can see that again, 29th to Monday. So he gives us some temporal kind of hook. And then again, all the usual topics. I'm cold and tired, or my cat ran away from me, or there is a robin singing outside my window. It is all red and very pretty. And this is really very, how to say, this is really very touching in a way, because those are voices from allow recording. Can you hear me again?
Ksenia, we can hear you, but we cannot see the demonstration.
Okay, so because I don't know why it quit me. I was just on my last slide. Can you see it now?
It's loading.
It's loading.
It's coming.
I don't know. It said that
it's coming. Yes, conclusions.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. So it said that it quit unexpectedly. Yeah. And so, basically speaking of microhistory, we can, by all those marginal evidences, we can reconstruct Murha's biography, and we can see where he received his training, in which parts of Ireland he was working, and in which years, because he documents like the annals of the historical events in Ireland at that time. And so we can reconstruct the place, we can reconstruct the time, and we also have a glimpse in, so to speak, in what was happening in his stream of consciousness, in his soul. We know that he loved poetry, that he loved animals, and he was probably clerically trained because he invokes God and Virgin Mary and writes different prayers very often. And in this way, although we do not have any evidence to reconstruct the lives of those common people, small people, so to speak, we still have their own voices speaking from us, from the margins of medieval manuscripts. So this is it. Sorry, I took my time, probably because I love the topic and I didn't really notice that time is not on my side. So I need to stop sharing now. Okay, cool.
Yes. Yes, please. Thank you very much, Ksenia. Yeah, it is obvious that you love your topic so much, and your love is corresponding to us. I think when we listened to you, it was brilliant. I think that my friends know that besides Celtic Revival, Joyce and Yeats, I'm a great fan of Irish medieval culture as well. Not a specialist, but a great fan, and relations between Irish and Western European medieval culture. So thank you very much for that. And special thanks for mentioning Joyce's novel and how this flood of consciousness and the way how Leopold Bloom is traveling along Dublin is corresponding to how those people were trying to show in these decorations their everyday feelings. So all this speaks about the immortality of everyday life.
That's very true. People don't change, yeah.
Yeah, or in modern times. So it was brilliant. Thank you very much for that. And now I'm welcoming any questions or remarks. We do not have much time for that, but please, if any, I'm welcoming it. Yes, Natalia Nikolaevna, you wanted to ask them something?
Just a second. Yes.
Yes.
Thank you very much for a very interesting report. I've got a question. Do you yourself project your research into what sphere? Is it culture studies, or is it microhistory, or is it philology at large? Could you give some
Yeah, basically, like the manuscript studies, they are by definition multidisciplinary. So because like how we work with, it doesn't matter with primary or secondary text. So let's speak of marginalia. So it starts with editing as such. So it starts with technical transcription and translation of those manuscripts. So it is edition on the one hand, so it is very technical part. Then it is obviously linguistics, because you need to understand like the language and translate it. Then it is literary studies, because we need to, by the means of literal analysis and intertextual echoes, either to connect the principal text to the margin or to exclude the possibility of connection. And then it is historical analysis, especially for the entries which have either those like mention of historical events, mention of the leaders of the country being like killed or being something else. So it is definitely interdisciplinary by nature, yeah.
Real work for real, well, philologists, so to say.
Yeah, but I would say exactly, it is philology in old good sense of this word, like exegesis basically, yes. So it is kind of overarching philology when you study different parts of it, yeah.
Thank you very much.
Thank you for the question.
I think this cooperation of different fields is so popular now in our contemporary world, and it is something that is very important when these interdisciplinary things are merged together. Tatiana, please, you have also a question.
Yes, Ksenia, first of all, thanks a lot, because you know, among many things I'm doing, I'm also dealing with the history of the English language, and on the one hand, and on the other hand, you will see it from my talk today. You know, I am interested in Celtic revival, and you know, these parallels that you made in connection with the old manuscripts. They were really valuable. This little poem, which was in Old Irish and then English translation, I think it's a very interesting source of comparison. That's one thing. And another thing, especially interesting, was this margin notes. And my little question is, when you read that, what was more difficult to read in terms of in terms of the handwriting, in terms of you know, structures or whatever? So what is more difficult, marginal text or the main text?
Marginal text is much more difficult because, first of all, the hierarchy of scripts is that the marginal text is written in super tiny letters. But then another difficulty is that marginal text, like the principal text, it is like editing a book. But marginal text, it is same as when we were taking notes at the lecture or so. So they are very often very heavily contracted. So when, like, you know, you see what I mean? So the words are not given in full, but it's the first and the last letter with this kind of like tilde in between of them, and go figure which verbal form he meant, you know? So they are much more difficult to read, yeah, in this terms.
A real detective story, but it makes all these scribes and monks and authors, they make them human, which was also nice to
Absolutely, yeah.
Thank you so much.
They make them human. Yeah, and then another thing is that I think that it is very often discussed that kind of postmodernism gave all those like hypertext, like Milorad Pavić, you know, approach, or Joyce approach. But in fact, it was already in medieval manuscripts, because the page, you see, the page has so many levels. It's working like hyperlinks, and all this different information is together. So, and we can imagine the scribe, he's copying something important, and then he's like, he gets distracted and he just writes, okay, a pretty white cat is now on my windowsill. And this is so human. And at the same time, we can see how this, exactly, people don't change, and the stream of consciousness works in the same way. It's like, now you go to watch YouTube videos with cats, and they were just looking for cats around them and kind of documenting it on the margins. Because like, we're all human, we get tired of serious work and we get carried away with other like more mundane things.
Thank you.
Thank you for the question.
I have a small question, Ksenia. You mentioned that Irish manuscripts were not so richly decorated as the Western European analogs that you showed so beautifully and so ironically. Why do you think it is so? Because we know that at the same time, the Gospels, the evangelic texts, were so richly illuminated, and we have examples of Book of Kells and Book of Darrow and others, which are unparalleled even with the continental. Why do you think in manuscripts it's vice versa?
I mean, like Book of Jar and Book of Kells are also manuscripts. I suppose. Well, I suppose this depends on the availability, on the tradition first of all, but also on the price of the what patron is asking you to do. Like you know, somehow all the kind of availability of materials for all those illuminations. Somehow I think that Book of Kells, it is an exception. That's the whole story. Other manuscripts are not illuminated. So somehow there was no such a tradition to decorate the manuscripts in the way similar to like Book of Hours of like in France or in Germany. And frankly, I don't know why. I never studied it, but definitely Book of Kells is an exception rather than a rule. That's why it is
which became so popular that it changed in mind perception of people because it's so richly decorated and became a museum. That's kind of funny.
It is unreal. Yeah, it is absolutely unreal. But like you know, another thing is that Book of Kells, as such, the Latin text of the Gospel contain lots of mistakes. So it is, and it seems to me like somehow paradoxically the primary aim of Book of Kells was the decoration, not the principal text, because the principal text seemed to be absolutely kind of neglected, you know. But so maybe it was just the focus of the kind of whoever commissioned this manuscript to be produced to be more like an art album rather than a textual.
It's a piece of art. It's a real piece of medieval art.
This is, yeah, it's absolutely outstanding. Yeah.
Well, thank you so much, Ksenia. If we do not have any other remarks and
I'd like to ask one question.
Yes, Maxim, please. You're welcome.
Ksenia, thank you for a wonderful report. Tell me, please, what manuscript do you use for cover of your report?
What manuscript do I use? What? I don't hear.
Cover. Page from what manuscript do you use as a cover for your report?
As a cover.
On the front page. The front page.
Oh, I need to have a look. I need to have a look which one was that. On the front page. Yeah. No, I need to remember. That was the one which I didn't take a note. I wouldn't tell you now.
You can later write it in chat to Maxim when you find out.
Yeah, I'm gonna have a look now.
Why it is interesting for me, some initials from this page, they're very similar to medieval Russian initials in Russian manuscript. So I'd like to ask you. Thank you.
Sure. Yeah, I'll check now. There couldn't be much. Like, yeah, I'll check now. I'll try to remember where I took it. Sure.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
Thank you once again. And now I pass the word to our second speaker, Dr. Hiram Morgan from University College Cork. As I say, we use the tradition of historical approach. So the second talk will be of the other time, but again, the historical, it's Tudor's view of Ireland and Russia. So Hiram, please.
Can you hear me?
Okay.
Hello.
Yes, and we can see the demonstration.
Thank you for this invitation, Andre. It's very good to be able to present again at your virtual Bloomsday event, and I'd like to welcome everybody to Carrigaline, County Cork today. All the participants and His Excellency the Ambassador. Today I'm going to speak about Tudor views of Ireland and Russia. As a 16th century historian, I thought this was the topic to speak about. Now, what I'm speaking about is the principal idea is that the English of the Tudor period, that's the 16th century, believed that the Irish and the Russians were barbarians. Believing smugly in their own superiority, the English disparaged both peoples on account of their mode of government, religion, economy, and manners. The English view of the Irish dated from the 12th century conquest. That of Russia was much more recent, dating from the 1550s. Although there are comparative references to the Irish in the texts about Russia, they're few, but they're important. They point to an interpretation which we now call Orientalist. The English, coming with their prejudices to Ireland as conquerors, to Russia as guests, they didn't know much of the language of Russia or of Ireland, and they were slow to learn those languages. And therefore, what they learned wasn't always accurate. What they learned or observed wasn't always accurate, and often relied on earlier sources, indeed earlier sources that went the whole way back to classical times. Now, my interest in this subject actually stems from the first representations of the Irish by Albrecht Dürer in 1521. And at the same time as doing his exotic drawing of Irish men, he drew these also drawings of women from the land of ice, both at the end of 1521. Now, these were examples of exotica in his terms. Now, the interesting thing is, although the women are often referred to as Livonian women, they're obviously quite clearly some version of Russian, some attempt to represent Russian aristocratic or Muscovite aristocratic women of the period coming from the land of ice. That is spelt in German E-I-S-S. It is not Iceland as in the island, it is the land of ice. And the interesting thing is that it's these general Western European views which precede the English views of Russia. And the first major interpreter of Russia is the ambassador sent out by the Holy Roman Empire, a man called Sigismund von Herberstein. And there were humanist accounts by Italian and German writers at the end of the 15th century and the start of the 16th, but the most famous was by this imperial diplomat from Slovenia. So he could interpret Russian pretty well on his own. And he conducted diplomatic missions from the emperors Maximilian and then Ferdinand I to Moscow. And so he wrote an important tome on Russia called Rararum Moscovicarum Commentarii, or generally known in English as Notes on the Muscovites. He wrote that in 1549. It was then in this account, this ethnographical account, that he introduced to the West the word Tsar, and also really pushed the idea of Russian despotism, describing the Tsar, and it was Vasily III he met, as having in his power, he holds over his people the ruler of Muscovy. He surpasses all the monarchs in the world. Now, when the English first went to Russia, they were already aware of these accounts of the imperial accounts of Russia, because they'd been published in Latin about 5 years before. Now, of course, the English attempt to go to northern Russia wasn't that at all. It was an attempt to go above Russia and to China. It was a mission to China. And it ended up going only as far as the White Sea and establishing relations with Moscow. Because it was really the first advent of what you could call today global Britain. Edward VI wrote this letter, as you can see here at the top. Edward VI, by the grace of God, King of England, France, and Ireland, etc., to all kings, princes, rulers, judges, and governors of the earth, that every man be free to join in friendship with the other, to love and to be loved, also to receive mutual benefits, which were, of course, the benefits of trade. And that was intended for the Emperor of China. But what was founded instead was not a Cathay company as they intended, but the Muscovy company. And it turned out that Ivan the Terrible was quite welcoming to the English when they arrived. He was seeking arms, particularly fighting to gain access to the Baltic. So he granted the English merchants a free monopoly of trade, and there was a very positive honeymoon period stretching to the early 1570s. The English ambassadors and merchants based in Moscow, there's a famous list of these guys: Chancellor, Jenkinson, Randolph, Horsey, and Fletcher. They became key observers of Russian affairs and Russian life. And subsequently, they ventured down the Volga and along the Ob and other rivers, seeking further trade links with Persia and Central Asia, because they were still after the spice trade with China and India. Occasionally, these commentators, because they wrote reports back to the Muscovy company, make remarks like the Tsar's bodyguards had access like gallow glasses, or there was a Siberian people whom they described as having Irish hairstyles. But the most irrelevant of these comments relating to Ireland and comparative remarks about Ireland are made by George Tuberville. He was secretary to Randolph, and in 1568-9, he advised a friend, Parker, to not to come to Russia under any circumstances, that it was an awful place. In sum, I say, I never saw a prince that did so reign, nor a people so beset with saints, yet all but vile and vain. Wild Irish are as civil as Russians in their kind. Hard choice, which is the best of both, each bloody, rude and blind. If thou be wise, as wise thou art, and wilt be ruled by me, live still at home and covet not those barbarous coasts to see. No good befalls a man that seeks and finds no better place, no civil customs to be learned where God bestows no grace. And truly ill they do deserve to be beloved by God, that neither love nor stand in awe of his assured rod. So this was quite a negative picture, not only of Russia, but of also the Irish. Essentially, a vile people ruled by a tyrannical prince who were violent and for whom God did not die. The interesting thing about this is that somebody like Tuberville would have had some idea about the Irish when he made his remarks about Russia. But the interesting thing is that the people who went to Russia, as I say here at the bottom, the English who went to Russia and the English who went to Ireland had in fact divergent career paths. The postman is obviously arriving in this house, sorry about that. But the English who went to Russia really had no contact with those who went to Ireland. And those who went to Ireland would have stayed in Ireland, maybe had some contacts back to England, or had other Atlantic contacts. But these people followed two paths. So the English in Ireland really had a vaguer idea of Russia. And this is where we enter the Tartars, or Tatars, as they're now known. And this is a famous illustration from 1580, a publication in Cologne, and it shows people in Muscovite costumes here and then Tartar costumes here. So they obviously conceived these people in proximity. The problem is that for many Western observers, the peoples got mixed up. And of course, the Tartars are an entirely, they're a distinctive people, Muslim, and in fact, enemies of the Russians at this time as allies of the Turks and based down on the southern steppe and in Crimea. But nevertheless, these were confused. But the particular thing is that the English writing about Ireland make frequent, or not frequent, but a number of key references towards Tartars, referring to the Irish as Tartar-like. So there's a number of examples in writings about the Tartar tendencies amongst the Irish. Sir Thomas Smith refers to the idle following of herds as Tartarians, Arabians, and Irishmen do. Sir Arthur Chichester, Lord Deputy of Ireland, refers to the people in those parts follow their crates, another word for herds, as they call them, in solitary places where they best like their pastures after the manner of the Tartars. So this is that both of those quotes are representations of a nomadic people or a people who practice transhuman herding. And of course, they do not use the land correctly and should be subject to colonization. Then we have an example about religion from the English Attorney General who came to Ireland in the early 17th century. He says there is no divine service amongst the Irish, no christening of children, no receiving of the sacrament, no Christian meeting or assembly, no, not once in a year, or in a word, no demonstration of religion than amongst Tartars, no more demonstration of religion than amongst Tartars or cannibals. Davies, again speaking of the Great O'Neill, said that the Great O'Neill will receive no rent or chief free, but like the Tartar, will have all in his possession, and consequently all the tenants of that country be his slaves and vassals. So that the Irish are tyrannical rulers or tyrannical landlords. And the interesting thing is here that although they're referred to as Turks or Tartars, that there's no attempt to compare with, say, Shane O'Neill and his violent actions, say, with Ivan the Terrible, but that doesn't happen. But there is this use of this word Tartar. And basically, the English in Ireland were conflating almost everybody from Lapland to Anatolia and across the Central Asia as onto this phrase and likening them to be nomads, people, of course, who lived on the steppe in Russia. And all of this is, of course, not very far away from Bismarck's slur, scratch Russian and find the Tartar. Now, of course, the word Tartar is also used in modern English, and it was also found, although not often, if it is used, and if it is used, it's used as a choice, as an angry, irascible person. And I think that is also has an ethnographic origin, that word Tartar. But it could also come from the word tart, meaning bitter, perhaps, or even Tartarus, as in a region of hell in the ancient Greek underworld. But I think it probably comes from the slur about a person who is threatening or verging on violence. But in the 16th century, these ideas about Tartars really came from the writings of Marco Polo and medieval travelers. But in fact, all of these ideas about nomadic herders on the steppe, go back through Strabo and Solinus and Pliny, classical geographers, to Herodotus. And that's where we enter another source. Enter the Scythians. The Scythians are the most barbarous people in the ancient world, and famously represented in a number of chapters in Herodotus, and then in subsequent Greek and Roman geographies. And of course, the Scythians lived above the Black Sea, across from Central Asia, across the top of the Caucasus to the regions of the Danube, what is now Ukraine, Crimea, etc. But the interesting thing is, in this view of the world, basically all Northern Europe was joined. And what happens is that some historiographers and writers connect the Scythians right across Northern Europe to Ireland, not least the work of Edmund Spenser in Ireland. And just note there the word Getae, which is people living beside the Scythians. So Edmund Spenser in 1596 wrote his view of the present state of Ireland. And he refers to the Irish as being mainly in origin Scythian. And a number of customs indicate this, or he thought that was the case. So there's an analogical approach or typological approach to culture being made in Spenser. He says, and on this, a number of references to the Irish and Scythians having Scythian customs, the which appeared plain to be the manner of the Scythians, as we may read in Aulus Magnus and Johannes Bohemus, both earlier geographers, one German there about the 1520s, and Olaus Magnus in Swede from the 1550s. And yet it is used among all the Tartarians and the people around the Caspian Sea who are naturally Scythians, to live in herds, as they call them, being the very same that the Irish bullies are, driving their cattle continually with them and feeding only on white meats. And so there's a number of references to the Irish having these Scythian attributes, which of course he claims that the Tartarians also have, or the Tartars. And Spenser made this connection. Well, there was an obvious connection in an etymology of the word Scota, the ancestral mother of the ancient Milesians, but he preferred the idea coming from Olaus Magnus about the Scythians having migrated to Northern Europe and having coming down to Ireland through Scotland, which was also called Scotia, of course, in his mind. And that is because, but most of Olaus Magnus's sources were actually about the Getae, the Goths, because Olaus Magnus had a theory about modern Scandinavia and the Goths. But basically, Spenser once again conflated them both. So Spenser is a big believer in the Scythian origins of the Irish. And the most important thing about the Scythians, as with the Tartars, if you have Scythian origins, you have basically you're descended from the most barbarous people of the ancient world, and therefore, in a sense, you're unreformable and incorrigible. And dangerous as well. Like Tamerlane the Great was on the London stage at this time, written by Marlowe, and it was subtitled, Who from a Scythian, this is Timur the Great or Tamerlane, who from a Scythian shepherd by his rare and wonderful conquest became the most puissant and mighty monarch. So Spencer published these views in the view of the present state of Ireland, and interestingly enough, it also comes through to Jonathan Swift when he wrote in his short view of the state of Ireland. He talks about Ireland being depopulated by the fancy of grazing after the manner of the Scythians. So the thing is here, what I'm trying to say is that in these odd ethnographical interpretations, basically many of the peoples of Russia and the area between Central Europe and the Urals, according to the likes of Spencer, were Tartars, and many of these had this Scythian origin. And he was also plotting a Scythian origin for the Irish. And in a sense, therefore, both were barbarian. So just to conclude with another odd point, in the 19th century, this is the strange vagaries of the internet, there was another Edmund Spencer who wrote a book on travels in Circassia and Crim Tartary. And he's no relation of the Spencer of the 16th century, but he is an ancestor of the current Charles, Earl Spencer of Althorpe, and I suppose also Lady Diana. So that's just the vagaries of the internet. And another sort of Joycean type digression. Okie doke, thank you.
Thank you very much, Hiram, for this very interesting paper. Thank you for completing it in another Joycean way, mentioning this other Spencer who suddenly appeared and inherited the tradition of regarding those peoples living in the area you mentioned. Now, colleagues, please, I am welcoming any questions or remarks to Hiram about what you've just heard. You are very welcome, please. Anyone?
I have a very
yes, Tatiana, please.
Comment, but it will be more a photograph than a comment. I will show you because you know, from absolutely different end, I came across this monument not far from Arkhangelsk. Maybe you have seen these photos, but they are devoted. Just a second, I'll show you. They are devoted to this first expedition, which was authorized by Edward VI. But while they were on the way, Edward died, and it was already Mary Tudor. And it is in Russian, of course, but you can see the Tudor rose here. And it is to Richard Chancellor, the captain of Edward Bonaventure, London. And they came here on the 24th of August, 1553, and then regular relations between Russia and England started. You know, and it is not far from, as I said, it is about something like an hour and a half from Arkhangelsk. And the monument itself looks like this. So it is all absolutely in the harbor, well, 5 minutes to the harbor where they came. But the interesting fact is that Ivan the Terrible, according to the sources I read at that time, Ivan the Terrible was so interested in contacts with Russia because he had very bad relations already with a lot of countries in Europe, so Russia was not accepted. And he was very pleased by this trip from this delegation from England, and he invited them, and especially specially organized all these sledges and horses, etc., to take them 600 kilometers to Moscow from Arkhangelsk. So that's just a little comment, but I think it's amazing what you have found. Very, very interesting. I enjoyed that. Thank you so much.
As we can say that people and peoples do not change in terms of literature or arts, the same in politics. As a comment to what you just mentioned, today we have the same things. Joseph, please, yes.
Yes, I'm amazed at Sir John Davies. I think these delicate poets like Spencer and Davies weren't able to deal with the raw realities of Irish life. But I'm amazed that he says there was no religion in Ireland, no services, no christenings. I wonder, does this shed a new light on religious state of Ireland at that time? And what do you think? Have you checked up, Hiram? Have you checked up?
No, I think that's I think that's a specific area of the country he's talking about, and it's just he's just in a particularly bad mood. That's not general. They usually say that these Jesuits are running around the place, you know, perverting people to or whatever, and they're more generally, of course, they describe whatever the Irish believe as generally superstitious, and it will be much more like what a George Turberville thinks, that, you know, invocations of saints and such likes, and sort of various forms of idolatry. Now that's a very strange statement by Davies, and an extreme one, but generally even Davies would not believe that.
Which part of Ireland was he in? Do you know?
I think he was at that stage, he was visiting somewhere in Munster, I think.
Oh, close to home.
Yeah, I'll check that up.
Right. Okay.
Thank you. You know, Hiram, you mentioned that the word Tatars was so frequently used by in the 16th century as describing in general those tribes or peoples living. But you know, this word in some way became an idiom which is still working in contemporary Russian language. It is very funny thing, but even today there are a lot of sayings using the word Tatar, and one of them, probably one of the most known in modern Russian language, is a saying like that the bad guest is worse than a Tatar. Which means then if the guest is staying too long in the entrance while leaving and he doesn't leave, or the guest is coming all of a sudden, he is called worse than a Tatar. I think it comes from very old times, obviously, but it's still living, this idiom in the language. It has nothing to do with real Tatar people who are living in Russia, but it lives itself, again, like in Joyce and texts. It lives its own life.
Sure. But the interesting thing also is like that these peoples were very well known to each other. Like one of Ivan the Terrible's favorite wives was a Tartar princess. But of course, the interesting thing for me is that Ivan the Terrible is described as a tyrant, but of course, there was Henry VIII in England, who was not exactly very nice to his wives or his enemies, and was quite despotic, to say the least. And you know, many of the relations with Ireland can be described as pretty despotic. You know, it's really many of these opinions are, as I say, are prejudice or in the eye of the beholder, really.
That's absolutely, yeah. Well, colleagues, any other questions or remarks to Hiram's talk? Thank you very much, Hiram. Again, it was really very interesting and very bright. Now I pass the word to our third speaker. Now we come back to St. Petersburg, and our third The speaker will be Dr. Tatiana Ivanova, Deputy Director of our Irish Cultural Center and Associate Professor of our Herzen State University. And her paper will be about John Synge's Playboy on the Russian stage, the spirit of revolution.
So can you hear me now?
Yes, now, yes.
Okay, and you can see the presentation.
Yes,
good.
Yes, right.
Good. Well, Synge's Playboy on the Russian stage is a very interesting story, how during the turmoil years between the revolution of 1905 and closer to 1917, and then in 1923, John Synge was on the Russian stage. So now the situation in Russia, as you know, in the years close to the revolution was far from being peaceful. Actually, it was a constant struggle between the party, revolutionary sentiment among the population, and polarization of the society was getting more and more obvious. And the spirit of freedom and change, this spirit of revolution, generated an interest in new repertoire and the need for the new types of performance. It started early. In 1908, actually, Alexander Blok, who was considered the head of Russian symbolism, he proclaimed the necessary changes in the theater of Russia. And there was a search for new plays coincided with the obsession with symbolism and poetry and on stage. And somehow these, feelings of revolution, love for symbolism, and the search for new plays taken together, they resulted in the Irish plays, in particular the Playboy, became most important factor connecting Russian and Irish cultures and literatures in the period between 1912 and 1923. Actually, to be quite precise, it's in 1925, but I'm going to speak more about 1923. Maybe because the cultural revolution that was proclaimed during Celtic Twilight was underpinned by belief that Irish society needed to do more than just rebel against the English crown. And playwrights and poets of that time insisted that a new community was necessary, one that was reflected and willing to accept changes. The first interest to the Irish drama, which I could find, dates back to 1912. The Studio, a popular Moscow journal, published the article on the Abbey Theatre, penned by Yaroslava Pimenova, and she wrote about the Celtic revival, the plays by William Butler Yeats, and was the first to mention Lady Gregory and John Milton Synge and the Playboy. Then in 1915, the first translations appeared. One of them was called Wonder Hero, Chudo Geroi in Russian, by Maria Potapenko. And the other one, more famous, was by Zinaida Vengerova and was called The Irish Hero. It is more important for us because so far I couldn't find much about Maria Potapenko, and she translated this play, but she didn't write about it. While Zinaida Vengerova shared her vision of the Irish culture in the preface, which I think is important. Here I must say thank you to my remote relative Elena Ivanova, who helped me with checking whether the translation of it exists in the English sources, and we couldn't find that because she currently lives in the United States, and she tried to look for the English translation, and then we translated the Russian text together into English. And you can see here some points she made. She mentioned this fact of the struggle for independence, that the island was deprived of its national language by the power of its oppressive conqueror. Ireland did not have national literature for centuries because there was a void or a gap between the 12th century when ancient Irish epic poetry declined and the end of the 19th century. But they immersed themselves, as she thinks, in the literary life in England. She mentioned Jonathan Swift, of course, and also Oscar Wilde and Bernard Shaw. And she considered that they enriched the English literature by the traits of the Irish national character: quick wit, vivid imagination, and stinging humor. In the works of the writers of the Celtic Revival, Ireland's pagan past and the living modern soul of the people became an embodiment of the national spirit, which had awakened after centuries of twilight spent in the shackles of political slavery, and revealed again its creative power by merging the undying values of the past with the realities of the people's life today. The writers of the Celtic Revival brought to their mission their love, knowledge, and understanding of the life of the people. Actually, I would strongly recommend well, to find it, and if for those who can read in Russian, to get acquainted with this text, because I think it's amazing. It's actually the first analysis of Celtic twilight in literature and literature studies. The Abbey Theatre, on the other hand, itself was looking for connections with other theatres in Europe. It is known that Sinch was in correspondence with German translator who prepared another play, The Well of the Saints, for Berlin. In 1907, Annie Honeman, who was, well, at that time, kind of a manager, she was negotiating with the Narodny Divadlo in Prague about possibility of cooperation. And finally, in 1915, the Playboy was staged in Paris, and Vengerova mentioned that in her preface. So it helped to find the way for Playboy, for saying to find the way to the Russian stage. Most amazing for me was this quote from Lunacharsky, who was one of the ministers of the Bolsheviks government later. But in 1915, he was in Paris, and he attended the performance, and in his article comparing the Irish humor and the humor of the French, he also shares his view. In Russian it is called humor Irlandsky and humor Francuski. So you could hardly find anything more whistling and harder stinging than the most typical Irish laughter, the laughter of Sir Jonathan Swift. His mace, which is crowned with a two-faced head of contempt and roar, sharpened by merciless logic and entwined with garlands of unbridled fantasy, was taken over by Bernard Shaw. And here Lunacharsky mentions Singh, but very close to him, to Shaw, there was one more humorist of the same type. And he says, whom we learned only thanks to the director of the theater, Ever Lunia Per. That for me was a kind of proof that before 1915 was not much known about that. Now we come to 1923. This year was really very hard, and the season, theater season of 1921 and 1922 at the same time was called the golden age of the Soviet theater, already called Soviet. It was a tragic year of the Povolzhia famine when millions starved to death all over Russia. NKVD was arresting and torturing people, and poets wrote about chaos. some poets died exactly at that year, like Bloch, for example. And actually, the performance itself, the first performance, was in January 1923. That's why 1923 is mentioned here. But of course, they were were preparing it for a year or so in advance. What is interesting is that Viktor Shklovsky, one of our prominent writers and journalists, wrote in 1923 the following most awful description of what was going on in Russia. And some say in Russia people are dying in the street, and in Russia people are eating or are capable of eating human flesh. Others say in Russia, the universities are functioning, in Russia, theaters are full. You choose for yourself what to believe, but why choose? It's all true. Well, this translation was official, done by Richard Selden in 2005. In Russian, it sounds even stronger to my mind, because не надо выбирать, это все правда. То есть правда и то, и другое. And this gives us some background. And now the performance itself. The performance was staged by Alexei Dickey. Alexander Radakov was the set designer, and it was the first studio of the Moscow Art Theater. And Kornei Chukovsky was invited to write a new translation. I will tell you why a little bit later. But Chukovsky gave a whole big article about that. Only one quote, as any people who live under oppression, the Irish are very sensitive and easily offended when it comes to the national feelings. So here he tries to analyze why Playboy caused so many riots in the Abbey Theatre when it was first staged. As a result, the Irish demand that Irish authors flatter them both in books and on stage. It was Chukovsky's vision. Synge was unable to flatter. He respected his own works too much for that. But the whole article is really, really interesting. Well, I will miss that. What is most amazing about this performance that originally the set and the costumes were ordered to Marc Chagall, and he did some drafts. However, you know, he interpreted this, well, here you can see the main characters' drafts for costumes, and that are from the Museum of Pompidou in Paris, the photographs. And now this is the stage set. And the stage set, as you can see or guess, is the image of Jesus Christ. And that was the reason why Chagall's scene set was not taken, was not accepted, because Chagall interpreted this play, first of all, as something anti-religious. That's why the Christ is falling, so the crucifix is falling. But at that time in Russia, it was considered too much to show the image of Christ, even in such a way. That's why they decided that they need a different designer for the set, and Radakov was found. He was a satirist, an illustrator of Satyricon magazine, and probably he agreed, because usually he didn't do much for the theater, but he agreed because his favorite themes were women emancipation and social equality. And from his point of view, the Synge's play provided both. So now I will show you some pictures that I could find of the magazine, which shows this set of by Radakov. And this is also a draft. And here you can see in Russian, The Irish Hero by Synge. This is an interesting picture of Sofia Gyatsintsova. She was very, very famous in the Soviet time. She actually lived a long life. I don't know whether she's alive now. I think not, but she lived as long as probably 88 years old. And she played Pekin Mike. But you can see that she doesn't look very Irish because of her makeup. And here we come to the main idea of Radakov. Of Dickey, because he wanted this play to be very international. That's why he thought that Vengerova's translation is too Irish, as he thought, too Irish, and he wanted something more international. More than that, although Chukovsky himself was against this point of view, during his performance, all characters changed costumes from Irish to Spanish to German to Russian. So there were all sorts of things to show that it is international idea of liberation, which may sound funny now, but at that time it was quite fashionable to make things international. Chukovsky's idea was that if this play is really national, it becomes international during this very fact, that it will be for all times and for all the world. Here you can see, just to have an idea, that there were a lot of press. There was a lot of press about this play. And here again, you can see some small images of the drafts by Radakov. And here already, unfortunately, it is not possible to do this in English, but it is already not Irish here, but it is not Irish hero, but just hero. The director decided to remove this word Irish from the title of the play, just because of this reason, which we can, be against it, but that's the fact of life. Chukovsky was against. He didn't like the performance much. He thought that it is too much of a good thing, because some ideas were excellent and some ideas were not, but they were too many things. On the other hand, Sergei Auslander, the theater critic, he wrote that this performance was accepted by the public by long storm of applause. And that he said that this Irish play was good for the Russians and they loved it. And the last thing I'm going to mention is that in 1925, in Chukovsky's translation, it was staged in Petrograd, or already Leningrad, because in 1925, it was already Leningrad. It was a different set, different costumes, and different director, but still the public accepted it very well. But the theater critics already at that time, actually, maybe because, the time was changing. In 1925, it was already closer to the end of this new economic policy period. But the theater critics condemned the performance in Leningrad because Sinj cannot express the interests and sympathies of proletarian spectators. So this critic really did not consider the fact that it was written at the very, very beginning of the century. And he said that it is not good enough for proletariat, which again sounds funny now. What is tragic about this, that both those critics Sergei Auslander and Guy Ardons, although their their articles were absolutely opposite, because Auslander liked the performance and liked the play, while Guy Adams condemned it for not enough proletarian. But they were both executed almost in the same year. One was executed in Leningrad, in Levashova, and the other one is not was shot not far from Moscow in this Butova field where a lot of people died. This shows this turmoil period which we had in Russia, and how this play was staged, how it was reported. Of course, I have a lot of material and I'm going to write an article about it. But the last point I'm going to mention is that later, that the play was so popular that after the first production in 1923, there was an attempt to adapt, sing, and transplant the story to a Russian village of modern times, modern meaning 1923. It was titled Accidental Valor, in Russian Nechayная Доблесть, by Yuri Yuryin, and it was staged by the Mali Theater in Moscow. And press reviews were mixed, but everyone recognized the fact that it was an adaptation of Singer's plot. And until now, well, for a long period, then after 1925, for quite a long period, the play was forbidden, and even the text was forbidden. Only in 1937, new translation by Vladimir Metalnikov appeared. And after that, unfortunately, because I like Tchaikovsky's translation more, it was staged, and since 1989 and up to now, it has been staged in many cities of Russia, including Moscow, St. Petersburg, Yekaterinburg, and Omsk, and is still being performed in Moscow, and as far as I know, even in 2 theaters. So that's all I wanted to say. Thank you, and I'm sorry if I was too long.
Well, thank you very much, Tatiana. Thank you.
A lot of material. That's why I was a little bit in a hurry, because there are more quotes I have, but unfortunately I cannot read all of this. Yeah.
It is very interesting and unique material, of course, and a lot of information. And I especially want to thank you for mentioning Zinaida Vengerova, who really was the principal figure for introducing Celtic revival on the Russian stage and to the Russian symbolists and to the Russian elite, arts elite on the whole. So I will mention her myself a little bit later today. Another thing just I wanted to mention, that you said that even today this play is still quite popular and staged in different Russian cities. And I know that my friend, one of my friends and colleagues who is interested in Irish culture, Alexander Plush, the artistic director of one of St. Petersburg theaters, Mimigrante, he and his team, they made their own version where they tried to make the mixture of these 2 translations you mentioned, by Tchaikovsky and by Metelnikov. And I played the role of, you know, editor of which of them would be more corresponding for the modern spectator while staged in modern circumstances in modern theater. So it's still alive, it's still very, you know, up till now interesting for the public, and it shows that to some extent those values and those conflicts shown in this play, they are universal, but of course they are a part of this Celtic revival culture, and a very significant part, because this play was also the most popular staged play in Dublin and in Ireland in that time. Not W.B. Yeats' very complicated plays, who were very well, you know, perceived as literature but Singed play and mostly Playboy of the Western World became the most popular staged play in Ireland of that time as well. So I'm welcoming any other remarks and questions because I already said what I wanted. Please, colleagues, if any other questions or remarks about what you've heard from Tatiana's talk.
Thank you for your comment. I actually thought that you would say about this Mimigrante. I deliberately did not mention it because my idea was to speak more about this old story, how it was staged. But I have a lot of materials about the language, about some other things they wanted to do. But Nemirovich Danchenko once visited the performance, and he realized that in one of the scenes they are wearing smokings, well, not smokings, or tuxedos.
Yes.
And he asked the director, why are they wearing tuxedos? They are Irish peasants. While he said, you see, we want to avoid any connections with the real story, not the real story, but with some links with real costumes and real situation, because it's an international and for all times, you know, humanistic idea for all times.
That's absolutely true. That's absolutely.
But Nemirovich Danchenko did not accept that. He said, I still do not understand why they should wear tuxedos.
That was also very interesting that Chagall was part of the story, and that his first variants of drafts were made by him, because this combination of Chagall and Singed is something very new and very interesting for me personally, and I think for most of my colleagues as well. Any other remarks, please, or questions? You see, we're speaking about Celtic revival. That's why most of remarks came from myself. I'm sorry to use the time.
It was too fast and nobody could follow.
No, I think
really well.
I already have Grace Neville's remark in chat that it's amazingly interesting paper, extraordinary slides, Chagall and Singed. So that's the same which I've just mentioned.
Yes, these Radakov's drafts, they are also very interesting. It's just, I don't know how, because these were electronic copies of the real magazine of 1923. And I didn't know how to, because I think we need to look for them in the museum. So maybe they have photographs somewhere that are bigger and can be, because like that, it's just, you know, difficult to see.
Okay, thank you very much for that. Thanks for those who mentioned different parts of the talks and interesting moments about it. Now I pass the word to our next speaker. Again, it's our traditional friend from Japan, from Tokyo, Professor Joseph O'Leary, originally from Cork. And today, Professor O'Leary will speak about George Moore and the matter of Ireland. Joseph, you are welcome, and I will now show your text. Can you see the text now?
Hello. Yes, I can. Hello, everybody.
Great.
Greetings from Nagoya, Japan. It's wonderful to be zoomed into St. Petersburg. And thank you very much for this wonderful event. In fact, my talk is in good continuity with the preceding ones. George Moore, in his later novels, was quite a medievalist. He wrote a novel on Eloisa and Abelard, and he wrote efforts to retell medieval tales and legends in a very humorous form in books like A Storyteller's Holiday. George Moore, I looked up just now to see how well was he received in Russia, and in the 19th century, when all the novels of George Eliot or of Dickens, for example, would be translated, sometimes in the very year they were published in English. Alas, only one of George Moore's novels was translated, A Drama in Muslin, translated in 1888. And that's a pity. I don't know of the more recent reception, because in a sense, George Moore is the most Russian of the Irish novelists. I will explain that. I printed a piece I just read from the Irish Times, which very accurately states the situation about Moore. Moore was an extraordinarily neglected writer, even though he wrote, some say 63 books. There are 2 collected editions, which are beautiful editions and which are a library in themselves. One of Moore's problems was that he couldn't leave well enough alone. He rewrote his novels. So you have to sometimes up to 6 different versions of his novels, which is very daunting for critics. You know, they can't handle that. But I think the basic problems with Moore are really the basic issues that cause offense, which are religion, sex, and politics. On all 3 fronts, Moore was not on the same page as most Irish people at the time. He was not on the same page as most English people of the time either. So he was always under a cloud, always treated with a certain amount of sarcasm. And you saw how Sing was received in Russia. Stupendous success in Russia from what I've just heard. Yet Sing's writings are contained in 1 volume, whereas Moore never seemed to have that international impact. However, that is changing, because amazingly, Moore's work is suddenly turning out, I would claim, to be much more important today than we had realized in the past. Moore is the first modern Irish writer. There is no writer before Moore who does anything like what he did. He is a thoroughly modern novelist. Born in 1852, older than Oscar Wilde, and influenced Oscar Wilde as well as, of course, Yeats, with whom he collaborated, and Joyce, whom he knew, and who visited him, I think very touchingly. In his last years, Joyce visited Moore in hospital and, you know, recognized that Moore was a kind of father to him, even though Joyce, as you know, mocked everybody, and he especially mocked Moore and said, the impulse of George Moore has nothing to do with real art. And that word impulse, it's one of the caricatures of Moore that circulated, that Moore was a kind of impotent writer, that he lacked passion, that he lacked the ability to take the bull by the horns and write a powerful work of art. I read 2 articles by 2 great Irish writers on Moore. One is by John Montague, poet, in 1950 or so. And it's a very good article, but he tends to recycle this vision of Moore as somebody who lacked something, who was kind of wishy-washy kind of writer. Much better is Brendan Kennelly's more recent article, where he talks about Moore as the chronicler of loneliness. There's deep loneliness at the heart of Moore's writings. And this is an aspect missed totally by John Montague, because he doesn't look at the stories which show this. The stories in the Celibates series, there's a whole string of stories about spinsters and frustrated homosexuals and not transsexuals, but gender troubled people. And this long series culminates in a stupendous story. It's one of the very greatest short stories, Albert Nobbs, by Albert Nobbs in one of his later stories, which has now received tremendous reception thanks to a play, and then thanks to a recent movie starring Glenn Close. She acted the role in the theatre. She desperately wanted to act it on the big screen, and she did so 30 years later, even though, of course, it probably suits her quite well, because it's an elderly Albert Nobbs. Now, who was Albert Nobbs? Well, Albert Nobbs was based on a waiter in a Dublin hotel whom George Moore met as a child and never forgot. And he has the theory that Albert Nobbs was not a man, was a woman in disguise. To survive, she lives as a man. And that situation is exploited in the story for every ounce of pathos and every ounce of comedy and every ounce of drama that it can provide. It's an absolutely wonderful story. Moore was a much stronger and more powerful writer than people realize. They're looking at him in the wrong way. Moore was a friend of Manet, the impressionist painter who painted him several times. And he was also an apostle of Impressionism. He's one of the main people to introduce Impressionism in England. So Moore's writing in many of his works is impressionistic. It's impressionistic landscapes, impressionistic soulscapes. It's true that he began as a disciple of Zola, so some of his early novels are tough, realistic novels. For example, A Mummer's Wife, which is about a woman who runs away from her husband and lives a bohemian life and comes to grief. Or A Drama in Muslin, the one that was translated into Russian, which is a wonderful, wonderful novel about young ladies from the ascendancy, from Big House in Ireland. I think they're Catholics, I don't remember, but they're in search of a husband. It's Pride and Prejudice crosses Flaubert and Zola. It's a very, very rich novel, and it's an incredibly interesting social chronicle. So there was a streak of Zola-esque realism in the early Moore, but as he went on, he more and more turned to the psychological side, more and more obsessed with style. And of course, people mocked him for that, most unjustly, because he sometimes did write extremely beautiful prose. There's a story told about Moore. There's so many stories told about Moore. Here's one of them. Moore is talking to his editor one day, and he says, it is important, wait a second now. It is important that he see the difference with, shouldn't it be he sees? No, Mr. Moore, that's a subjunctive. It's important that he see. Well, what's a subjunctive? A subjunctive is a form of the verb which expresses the uncertain, the indeterminate, the optative, what one would wish, what one would desire, what one would surmise. Oh, that is wonderful. From now on, I will write only in subjunctives. The story is probably not true, but it's one of those stories that captures something about Moore's dreamy style. He writes in reverie. It's the stream of consciousness. No, it's not the stream of consciousness. The stream of consciousness is too hard and everyday. It deals with, like Mr. Bloom, it deals with physical objects. And though Moore was a friend of Edward Dujardin, who's supposed to have invented the stream of consciousness, in fact, he didn't really follow. It's basically influenced by Flaubert, but still more. It's not stream of consciousness, but what you call style indirect, you get inside the mind of the character. But more than by Flaubert, he was influenced by Turgenev, and he had a profound admiration for Turgenev. He wrote many essays on Turgenev. Can you hear me? There's very lot of strange noises here. Can you hear me? Hello? Hello?
Yes,
oh,
we can hear you. We can hear you. That's okay.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
Yeah. Turgenev once talked about Dostoevsky's novel, Poor Folk. I don't know how you translate that in Russian. And he said, Dostoevsky's Poor Folk is fine linen, but Turgenev's novels are fine silk. So he aimed at that kind of novel where the character is perceived, the character is perceived in their psychological essence and is expressing themselves. And he achieved, to my mind, some very stupendous things. I first became interested in Moore as a result of my dear friend Robert Welsh, who died a few years ago. He was reading reams of Moore's autobiography, Hail and Farewell, which is an astonishing 3-volume chronicle of the 10 years Moore spent in Ireland at the height of the Celtic revival. And he got a group of us together to write a book on Moore, to produce a collection of essays on Moore under the title The Way Back in 1982. And this was when nobody was writing about Moore. There was only one person, Elizabeth Grubgeld, who was a wonderful critic. And of course there was Richard Cross, is it? I forget now, who was bringing out editions of his works. But in the last 20 years, there's been a huge surge of interest in Moore. There's been 6 international conferences and a lot of monographs and so on. So there's a buzz around Moore. So I said religion, sex, and politics. Well, I mostly talked in a very wide sense there of sexuality, of Moore's temperament, the temperament that Manet captures very well in those portraits, a temperament that Moore himself couldn't understand. He was androgynous, he was searching for himself. But now coming to religion and politics, religiously he was a Catholic landlord. He was a member of the Ascendancy, but a Catholic member. And he, in fact, really hated the Catholic Church from about 1888 or so. He was against Catholicism because he thought it was repressive and cruel to people who didn't fit its mold. And he became a self-professed pagan. In his early years were in Paris, and his first publication of note was Pagan Poems, which were, I never saw that book actually, but it's supposed to be bringing Baudelaire into English. That was attempted by Algernon Swinburne before, but it seems that Moore's efforts created quite a splash. Pagan Poems, and his first novels are about bohemian life in Paris, not novels that nobody knows nowadays. One is called Louis Seymour and Some Women. And the pagan Moore comes across in the first of his many autobiographical books, which is called Confessions of a Young Man, which is a big influence on Joyce's portrait. In fact, everything in Moore can be seen as an influence on Joyce. He was the inventor of the Irish short story, The Untilled Field, his first volume of short story, his volume of short stories, not his first, is stories set in the Irish countryside. Joyce, a few years later, fills it out with stories set in the capital, in Dublin. His influence on Joyce is immense. But his struggle with Catholicism, it's in a way it's kind of crude because it's an assertion of paganism. And as a boy, Moore was unhappy. He was a bad student and he was neglected, I think, by his family. And he loved racing and horses and that kind of world. This was his link with reality. And one of his greatest novels, Esther Waters, is set in that world of race courses and the like. So this was his first stance, paganism. But then he wrote a most extraordinary 2-volume work about an opera singer who becomes a nun. And it's a struggle between the sensual or sexual. It's very frank, the word sexual is used, and it's pretty frank affairs, and her desire to become a nun. And it's psychologically, it's very, very good. And it's extremely Catholic and extremely sensitive to all the Catholic issues. In 1900, George Moore wrote a letter to the Irish Times announcing that he was no longer a Catholic, he was a member of the Church of England, an Anglican. Not sure what the Church of England thought of him. Sorry, not the Church of Ireland, the Church of Ireland, the Irish branch of the Anglican Communion. But he went on to write, he still went on to write about Catholic, Roman Catholic topics. There are many priests in his writings, of course, and one of the most famous ones is in a story called Homecoming, short and beautiful story, where the hero, having lived in New York for a long, long time, decides to come back to Ireland. Oh, how beautiful. So he comes back to County Mayo, Moore's home area, and he loves the people, loves the landscape, and loves a young girl with beautiful eyes, pure blue eyes, and so on. But it's all ruined by the parish priest, who is a bully and who breaks up dances and whose power over the people is shocking to the hero. So he gives up the lady, he gives up the landscape, he gives up his home and goes back to New York. Homesickness takes on a double meaning. I'm homesick, I'm nostalgic. When I get home, I'm sick, I want to run away. But it ends up with he's haunted by the image. Many years later, he's haunted by the memory of the girl's eyes and of the blue line of wandering hills, that vague and misty landscape of Loch Cara, the lake near Moore's ancestral home. A very touching ending. Frank O'Connor chose that as the opening story in his anthology of Irish short stories. Religiously, Moore had a tremendous problem with the Catholic clergy, as had nearly all the great writers of Ireland ever since. I shouldn't say this because I was ordained a Catholic priest 48 years ago today, and I carry a burden of guilt, of unfulfilled duty, and so on. Now, Moore did write a very great novel called The Lake. I wrote an article on this in Robert Welch's book with the title Father Bovary, because like Emma Bovary, the priest in the story, whom Moore called Oliver Gogarty. What a stupid thing. I mean, Oliver Gogarty said, why did you use my name? And Moore said, well, what better name? But I think it's a very distracting name. There are 3 versions of that novel, and the 3rd version to me is the best. The protagonist changes, the protagonist is, it's about a priest and a woman. And the first version, the woman is a very high-class lady called Rose Lester, if I remember correctly. She goes to Bayreuth and writes some long letters about Wagner. Moore was a tremendous Wagnerite, as was Joyce. And it's a bit heavy-handed, but in the 2nd version, in the 3rd version, she changes to Nora Gwynn, a much more down-to-earth Irish woman, not as down-to-earth as Joyce's Nora, to be sure. But the drama passes in the priest's soul as he walks around the lake, brooding on the struggle going on within him, the struggle with the church, which is freezing him to death, and the lure of new life in the figure of the woman. And in the end, he swims across the lake, leaving his clothes behind, and starts a new life. And it's obviously one of those Bildungsroman or gospels of life, gospel novels, just like Joyce's Portrait, where the protagonist reaches self-determination and breaks the shackles that bind him fast. So religiously, I think looking at Moore's entire opus, it's not really unfriendly to religion. It's fascinated by religious things, but in a questioning and kind of agnostic way. Of course, I didn't mention his novel, The Brooke Kerith, which is an amazing novel. It's the story of Joseph of Arimathea, and then Jesus, and then St. Paul. And it's a psychological study of these three people, Jesus being regarded just as a kind of a prophet, who, again, do I remember correctly, he doesn't die on the cross. It's one of those stories where you meet the risen Jesus, and St. Paul meets, you meet the Jesus who is supposed to be risen, but has in fact never died. And St. Paul has a dialogue with him, which is imitated in Nikos Kazantzakis' The Last Temptation of Christ. We have the same situation. It's also an influence on D.H. Lawrence's famous story, the escaped cock, also known as The Man Who Died. So this, of course, is 1916, it was written. It's the period of modernism in the Catholic Church, when all questions about the historical Jesus were highly dangerous for theologians, but Moore didn't have to worry about that. On politics, well, Moore, I don't think was very political, but his brother was a senator in the Irish government in 1923. And during the Civil War, their house, Moore Hall in County Mayo, was burnt down and is now a barren shell. People talk about rebuilding it, but one wonders why. About 100 beautiful houses of that kind were destroyed because arson was a favored method of warfare in those troubled times. So politically, I don't think there's much to be said, but on the other hand, Moore is an explosively liberative character by his frankness, by his honesty, by his modernity, his good-natured modernity. He isn't a bitter. I mean, Joyce is bitter, but Moore is effervescent. He's expressing himself freely but courageously. I think perhaps on a personal level, he wasn't very pleasant. He was over familiar with people, and he rubbed them up the wrong way. Yeats and he had quite a tense relationship, and they write delicious, malicious gossip about each other. But Yeats, in his reply to Moore in his autobiographies, his portrait of Moore in the autobiographies is very interesting. And he seems to be making fun of Moore and mocking Moore. But at the end he says, well, Moore did write 6 great novels, and he almost reached the golden, the holy grail that he spent his whole life seeking for. Kind of compliment. And those 6 great novels that he lists were A Drama in Muslin, A Mummer's Wife, Esther Waters, The Lake, Evelyn Inn's Sister Teresa, the novel about the opera singer who becomes a nun, and The Brooke Kerith, a very good choice from among Moore's many novels. So all of these issues that were against Moore in his time are now for Moore. Now we appreciate his sexual frankness, his desire for liberation. We appreciate that he didn't take politics seriously, that he probably regarded it with a lot of skepticism. And we appreciate his religious, what was abnormal then is maybe more normal now, even in Ireland. So I think we're ready to rediscover Moore, re-establish him as the founding figure of modern Irish literature, and also stop judging him by saying, oh, he wasn't as great a novelist as Joyce, which is a very stupid thing to say, because nobody is as great a novelist as Joyce. And what Joyce was doing was something quite different from what the vast majority of novelists want to do. So let more be more, I say, and let's have more. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Joseph, for this wide description of George Moore's creativity and his most significant novels and the most interesting features of that novels. And of course, that comparison with Joyce, and to some extent that's interesting as well, because we today are trying to find any kind of links of everything we're talking about with Joyce being here in Bloomsday. Now, colleagues, please, any questions and remarks about what you've just heard? You are welcome. Natalia Nikolaevna, please.
Thank you very much for your interesting report. You have opened up a new name for me in a way. And while I was listening to your report, I looked up some facts about this writer in Wikipedia. And I have read there that this writer was was suggested at one time to be called an Irish Turgenev. Have you got any ideas as to why and what links are there?
I think that's an excellent description of Moore, an Irish Turgenev. Can I mention that Turgenev was influenced by Irish literature? Do you know this story? Turgenev's brother, I think his name was Alexander, visited Walter Scott, and in Walter Scott's house he met Maria Edgeworth, an Irish novelist, and he was very impressed by her and sent her books to Turgenev. And they influenced the sportsman's sketches, you know, the Diary of a Huntsman by Turgenev. And he said, I learned two things from Edgeworth. Number one, to enter the mind of the peasants, to take the peasants' point of view. And number two, to make the narrator himself a character in the story. Conversely, the influence of Turgenev on Irish literature is huge. I mean, in the case of Moore, it's quite explicit. He writes about Turgenev a lot, and he always stresses the virtues of Turgenev and the crudity of Zola. For they turned against Zola very much. He said Zola has no psychology. Zola doesn't understand human beings at all. He creates drama, but not psychology. And then after Moore, there's a whole string of Irish short story writers who are dealing with that sort of middle ground of experience, not intense melodrama and not complicated plots, but just, you know, things that happen in a village, little relationships between people, things that are almost nothing. Mary Levin, for example, is a very great Irish writer. Her short stories are very Turgenevian. Frank O'Connor, greatly admired Turgenev. He writes about him in The Lonely Voice, his famous book on the short story. Turgenev and Chekhov would have been his two heroes. So Turgenev is everywhere, and people are afraid to follow it up because they don't know Russian and so on. They're troubled about the whole idea of following it up, but it should be followed up.
Thank you. Thank you. It's an interesting point, of course. And that you mentioned that Turgenev for him was silk, with this comparison of Turgenev and Dostoevsky and their works like cotton and silk. It's a very interesting remark. Yeah.
I have a question.
Yes, please.
Joseph, thank you for your talk. My first question is that we received this link for these wonderful photographs. If you like, I can show them now.
Okay, do. Oh, great.
Yes, but my question is actually the following. In some sources, they say that George Moore was so long in Paris that he almost forgotten English language. So I realize that he has not forgotten it completely. But from your point of view, do you feel something in his language which is not very common or maybe unusual under the influence of French in his work?
Yes, I do. You know, Yeats was dyslexic, right? And I think Moore also had some kind of learning disability. He was a very slow learner in school. He only gradually, it's as if he learned, you know, he began as a painter. He wanted to express himself through painting in Paris. And as often happens, this kind of collapsed and he turned to literature instead. So it was a slow process, but he kept at it with great diligence, and in his 30s began to write extremely substantial works. But yes, he's a self-conscious stylist, and it's almost as if he didn't have a natural voice of his own. He always had to write it. And this is a very interesting point and a difficult point to pin down. But there is something unusual, you know, about his attitude to language.
Mm-hmm.
But on the other hand, when you read things like Conversations in Ebury Street, which is it's just casual discussions with his friend, who was also a friend of Henry James, Goss, you know, Edmund Goss, who wrote the famous novel himself. He just sails in and says, "How are you this morning, Goss? And what do you think of Tolstoy? And the conversation is utterly delightful to read and utterly overflowing and spontaneous, because Moore was a great host. In Dublin, people craved to go to his dinners, which were absolutely delightful. In Ulysses, remember Stephen Dedalus is very miffed because he wasn't invited to Moore's party. So the bubbling conversation, and again in Hail and Farewell, the novel is full of conversations, and the writing is really spontaneous. Now that's Moore's ancestral home. You can see it's only an empty shell now. And these woods are the dreamy County Mayo landscape where he would have walked around.
Yes, they are beautiful.
Yeah, very romantic scapes.
Yes. This is Loch Corra, which is a very shallow lake. It's called a marl lake or something. It's a special kind of lake, and it's very threatened ecologically at the moment. The lake of the novel, The Lake, is about that. And there's an island in the middle, Castle Island, which was frequented by monks at one time. And I see this is the real Moor. There's the Irish Moor, then the Parisian Moor, then the London Moor. But he comes back to this again and again, you know.
Moor Hall.
It's the same lake, I believe.
It must be.
Yeah.
You
Yes.
can see why he wanted to be a painter. I mean, this was the influences, you know, and he wasn't a very literary youth, you know, unlike most writers. He wasn't, as far as I know, he wasn't a great reader in his youth.
Yeah, beautiful, beautiful pictures. Thank you for sharing it. Well, thank you, colleagues. Now I pass the word to the last speaker of our morning section, Professor Natalia Bochegova from the Kurgan State University, and her paper today will be Search for Identity and the Dialogue of Cultures, Ireland, USA and Russia, in Frank McCourt's memoir, Tease. Well, I pass the word to Natalia, please.
Thank you. I believe I will need to share my screen as well, because, just a second. Well,
yes.
Because since I don't have a presentation, I will draw your attention to, just a second, to some of the examples which may be difficult to perceive just by ear, so to say. Well, and have I shared my screen? Probably yes. Can you see the text of the report?
Yes, we can.
There's the first example. It will be somewhere soon. All right. Anyway, I would like to say by way of introduction that my report will also deal, as the report of the previous lecturer, with the writer whose consciousness, whose mind continuously oscillates between two cultures. The American one, because he just New York is in the center of the narrative, and his mother culture, his first culture, it's the Irish culture. Well, and there is, but the writer which I will speak about is the 20th century writer, Frank McCourt, probably a well-known writer as well. Many may have read his novels. Well, let me start with the idea, with the statement that many researchers look at the issues of ethnos and ethnicity in connection with the national identity category, which is of special interest for this research. Like many scientific terms, the national identity category is studied by the series of different sciences, related sciences. It's social psychology, sociology, political science, intercultural communication, linguistics, and so on and so forth. National identity is a fluid category. It changes, although its main components remain the same, remain constant. They are the individual, the family, and the nation. In political science, the national identity is thought of as the unity of the three main ideas that are always present in the consciousness of the majority of the population of a certain state. It's the common past or common experience of nationhood, positively viewed by the public consciousness. Then it is a set of common values for a given society and the common responsibility for a country's future. Ivanova Arnold understands by, well, this is a Russian scholar and a former long-serving professor of Herzen University. So she understands, by identity, she understands a kind of stereotype that characterizes the individuals belonging to a nation. She believes that the stereotype includes the commonality of language, culture, mentality, behavior, appearance, clothing habits, food, housing arrangement, etc. The role of national identity is growing. Researchers think that the reason for this growth is the search for landmarks and consistency in the unstable world oversaturated with information. So the scholar Stefanenko thinks that repeated contacts that are direct or mediated by the means of mass communication actualize ethnical identity. She writes, I quote, "Because only through comparison one can comprehend most clearly one's Russianness, Jewishness, etc. as something special." Well, let's pass over closer to the core of our report. Speaking about culture, we cannot but agree, I think, that culture is made up of differences. Those who share Anna Vizhbitskaya's views on semantic universals will agree that apart from the most general notions expressed by the so-called semantic primes, everything else in cultures is differences encoded in language. Our research has shown that there is ethno-cultural specifics at all language levels when we study fiction: lexical, syntactical, morphological, phonetic. And now let us consider in this slide a number of examples from the autobiographical novel by Frank McCourt, his novel Tis. Frank McCourt was, and he died in 2009, at the beginning of the 21st century, he was an Irish-American writer. He is a representative of the so-called hyphenated literature. Hyphenated culture is an exclusively American phenomenon, and the first component of the term refers to the conceptual space of the source of the old culture. That is, it's like Irish American or Chinese American or something. McCourt won a Pulitzer Prize for his first novel, Angel's Ashes, which was written in 1996. The novel is a memoir that narrates about the troubles of a poor Irish family, first in the USA and then in their homeland, Ireland. Tis, which is in the focus of this research paper, is the sequel of the literary biography. It describes the life of the eldest of the McCourt's children, Frank, after his return to the United States at the age of 19. And it details the process of a young Irishman's integration into American culture. Well, among the many cultural codes and scenarios that make communication difficult for him, it's worthwhile mentioning the differences between the British, but in this case, Irish English, so to say, and American English. On the lexical level, the differences in vocabulary as Frank McCourt describes them. If I had the money, I could buy a torch and read till dawn. In America, a torch is called a flashlight. Here, after highlighted videos as well. A biscuit is called a cookie. A bun is a roll. Confectionery is pastry, and minced meat is ground. Men wear pants instead of trousers, and they'll even say this pant leg is shorter than the other, which is silly. When I hear them saying pant leg, I feel like breathing faster. The lift is an elevator, and if you want a WC or a lavatory, you have to say bathroom, even if there isn't a sign of a bath there. And no one dies in America. They pass away or they are deceased. And when they die, the body, which is called the remains, is taken to a funeral home where people just stand around and look at it, and no one sings or tells a story or takes a drink. And then it's taken away in a casket to be interred. They don't like saying coffin, and they don't like saying buried. They never say graveyard. Cemetery sounds nicer. So deviation from the norm in pronunciation has always been a mark of this people's certain social status, which is directly connected with the economic position of the speaker. And Frank McCourt writes about these issues in his novel. The whole class would stare at me and wonder who's the one with the accent. I could try an American accent, but that never works. When I try it, people always smile and say, "Do I detect an Irish brogue?" As noted above, the identity of many Americans is still defined as consisting of two constituent parts, American and the name of a country or the country of immigration. This is a unique feature of American identity reflected in the language and the discourse related to the issues of ethnic and cultural background and cultural stereotypes. Why is it the minute I open my mouth, the whole world is telling me they are Irish and we should all have a drink? It's not enough to be American. You always have to be something else, Irish American, German American, and you'd wonder how they'd get along if someone hadn't invented the hyphen. In American culture, the person's wish to fit in, integrate, and become successful in the American society and take a specific social rank is typically combined with an acute feeling of the native cultural identity. As noted by a researcher, Strenuk, the Irish national identity is built up on the basis of several main meaningful categories. They are narrativization of political history, in brackets, victimization and memorization of collective trauma, religious identity, and space conceptualization. This is from the work by Strenuk, and there is a link to it. It's possible to find this quotation and to read her research. In Frank McCourt's novel, we see the links to this theoretical meditations. An example: when Davis leaves, the captain says, "The Irish McCourt, we gotta stick together, right?" The old Irish had told me, and my mother had warned me, stick with your own. Marry your own. The devil you know is better than the devil you don't know. Numerous examples from literary and publicistic discourse help us to understand how two identities match in the consciousness of the individual who exists in the dominant culture. The leading position in the conceptual space in this case is taken by the concepts of work ethics. For example, in McCourt's novel, I could drink Irish, eat Irish, dance Irish, read Irish. My mother often warned us, marry your own. And now old-timers tell me, stick with your own. If I listened to them, I wouldn't be rejected by a Rhode Island Episcopalian who once said, "What would you do with yourself if you weren't Irish?" And when she said that, I would have walked out, except that we were halfway through the dinner she had cooked, stuffed chicken with a bowl of Bordeaux that gave me such shivers of pleasure I could have tolerated any number of bobs at myself and the Irish in general. I'd like to be Irish when it's time for a song or a poem. I'd like to be American when I teach. I'd like to be Irish American or American Irish, though I know I can't be two things, even if Scott Fitzgerald said the sign of intelligence is the ability to carry opposed thoughts at the same time. The concepts of work ethics, just like many key concepts of any ethnic group, are rooted in religious ethics. Religious life, in my opinion, is still a part of cultural life, a great part of the cultural life for the Irish and the American people. The Sunday sermon is a part of the cognitive base of the English language personality, because this segment is usually filled with information at an early age. The constituent of the culture conflict in Frank McCourt's novel is the conflict of the thesis of religious ethics, in this case, Catholicism versus Protestantism. Other students are easy about raising their hands, and they always say, well, I think. Then the professor tells us ideas that don't drop fully formed from the sky, that the pilgrims were in the long run children of the Reformation with an accompanying worldview, and their attitude to children were so informed. Here I am in the library in Queens, discovering Irish literature, wondering why the schoolmaster never told us about these writers till I discover they were all Protestant, even Sean O'Casey, whose father came from Limerick. No one in Limerick would want to give Protestants credit for being great Irish writers. And another quotation, I did and Maggie did. The marriage crumbled. Slum-reared Irish Catholic have nothing in common. Catholic has nothing in common with nice girls from New England who had little curtains at their bedroom windows, who wore white gloves right up to their elbows, and went to proms with nice boys, who studied etiquette with French nuns and were told, girls, your virtue is like a dropped vase of us. You may repair the break, but the crack will always be there. Slum-reared Irish Catholics might have recalled what their fathers said. After a full belly, all is poetry. As was previously noted, the food code and its specifics, preferences, and restrictions is a major part of any culture, It's also a part of belonging, especially the restrictions part, to the religious doctrine. Like other culture codes, the food code is presented in the language with the corresponding vocabulary and cultural scenarios. And Frank the Code describes some of them. So the grandmother says hi, but does not offer hand or cheek. It's dinner time, and there's corned beef and cabbage and boiled potatoes, because that's what the Irish like to eat, according to Zoe. And another example, all along the avenue there are shops with gourmet foods, and if I ever enter such a place, I'll have to bring someone who grew up respectable and knows the difference between paid foie gras and mashed potatoes. All these shops are obsessed with French, and I don't know what they're thinking, or is it that you pay more for something printed in French? And another example, Alberta calls us into dinner, tuna casserole with green salad. In the example to follow, we observe that the use of the vocabulary that objectifies the concept of food and the concepts related to high culture, we will see the names of the works of art in one micro context. In this case, the lexical items of food, knockwurst and liverwurst, become the symbols on the level of the text's conceptual space and mark the transition of the character between the life stages. This is the example. I am weary of knockwurst and liverwurst, liverwurst from German, and the feel of frozen meat on my shoulders every day. Well, he was working in the docks. I push the knockwurst away and leave a half a stein of beer and walk out the door across Hudson Street, along Bleecker Street, not knowing where I am going. And here I am in Washington Square, and there's New York University. And I know that's where I have to go with my GI Bill, high school or no high school. The study of daily life culture attracted the attention of historians, anthropologists, and sociologists, because it is the daily life that allows us observing the value code in action. From the cognitive linguistics point of view, the daily life concepts are mostly visible in scripts or cultural scenarios, which constitute the cognitive base of any society. It's a well-known scientific fact that the researcher cognitive linguists Schenk and Abelson in their work dedicated to scripts started with a description of scripts as the main building blocks of the daily life awareness. The script or scenarios laid in the daily life are standard chains of events that constitute our understanding of the frequently repeated events, and they resort to a well-known example of the script of a restaurant. So the cultural scenarios are commonly not real, not acknowledged, not realized, not understood by the members of the by the people belonging to one and the same culture, but they draw attention of the receptive mind from the other culture. For example, Frank McCourt describes some of the American cultural scenarios, which are somewhat surprising to him. Mike Small came from another world, she and her football player. They might be from different parts of America, but they were teenagers, and it was the same all over. They went on dates on Saturday nights, and of course, she would never be at the door waiting for him, because that would show she was too eager. And word would get around if she had, and she would be alone every Saturday night the rest of her life. The boy would have to wait in the living room with a silent dad who always looked disapproving behind his newspaper, knowing what he did on dates in the old days himself, and wondering what was going to be done to his little daughter. The mother would fuss and want to know what movie they were going to and what time they'd be home, because her daughter was a nice girl who needed a good night's sleep to keep that glow in her complexion for church tomorrow morning. And another example. After the movie, they'd have hamburgers and milkshakes at the soda fountain with all the other high school kids. The boys in crew carts, and the girls in skirts and bobby socks. That is what I saw in the movie, or what I heard in the army from GIs who came from all over the country. In the immigrant's mind, there is always a certain ambivalence in the attitude to the culture they have left. On the other hand, it is nostalgia for the usual cultural concepts expressed in the description of the new cultural concepts and scenarios as strange. On the other hand, it is an acute feeling of all the negative sides of the country they had left in the past, which can hinder, which can be a problem for the successful adaptation and acculturation in the new society. And Frank McCourt is sometimes very critical of his old culture, which in fact, in reality has made him what he is, a unique writer who had benefited from the interrelation of his two cultures. Anyway, the example is, from time to time, the old man leaned around Paddy to tell me, stick to your own, stick to your own. I am in New York, land of the free and home of the brave, but I am supposed to behave as if I were still in Limerick, Irish at all times. I am expected to go out only with Irish girls who frighten me with the way they are always in a state of grace, saying no to everything and everyone, unless it's a Paddy Mark who wants to settle on a farm of land in Roscommon and bring up 7 children, 3 cows, 5 sheep and a pig. I don't know why I returned to America if I have to listen to the sad stories of Ireland's suffering and dance with country girls, Mullingar heifers, beef to heels. The concept of old country is usually objectified in the immigrant discourse with negative or ironic connotations in this novel. The man at the beneficial finance company says, "Do I detect a brogue?" He tells me where his mother and father came from in Ireland and how he plans to visit himself, although that would be hard with 6 kids, haha. His mother comes from a family of 19. Can you believe that, he says, 19 kids? Of course, 7 died, but what the hell? That's how it was in the old days in the old country. They had kids like rabbits. Remember the statement about stereotypes, which was quoted from Ian Arnold's work. So the issue of language, of a language or linguistic personality, языковая личность, language personality, is central for culture, for any culture. The loss of the national language leads to the diffusion of the ethnos's cultural identity. On the other hand, refusal to learn a different language is often associated with isolationism and narrow-mindedness. An example from Tees. There was an old man smoking a pipe on the stool beside Paddy, and he said, "That's right, son, that's right. Tell your friend there that you have to stick with your own. All my life I stuck with me own, dug holes for the phone company, all Irish, never a bit of trouble, because by Jesus, I stuck with me own, and I seen young fellas coming over, marrying all kinds and losing their face, and the next thing they're going to baseball games, and that's the end of them." And so on and so forth. Well, for the sake of saving time, let us switch over to another a way of objectifying the cultural dialogue, the level of precedent texts. So the precedent texts, these are texts which originate from the cultural tradition of an ethnos. And speaking of the cognitive base of a particular language personality, it's interesting to note the interweaving of cultural codes and texts that create this base. The English language discourse shows concepts of Russian literature that had the most effect on the conceptual space of native English speakers in general. And the work by Frank McCourt, just remember in the previous report, Moore was considered to be an Irish Turgenev, and it came to my mind now that Catherine Mansfield wrote somewhere in her diaries, "I am an English Checker," so there has always been that kind of dialogue. And the work by Frank McCourt verifies this statement. Another orderly pushed a book cart into the wood, and I have a feast of reading. Now I can finish the book I started coming from Ireland on the ship, Dostoevsky's Crime and Punishment. I'd rather read Francis Scott Fitzgerald or P.G. Wodehouse, but Dostoevsky is hanging over me with his story of Raskolnikov and the old woman. It makes me feel guilty all over again after the way I stole money from Mrs. Funicane in Limerick when she was dead in the chair, and I wonder if I should ask for an army chaplain and confess my awful crime. The topic of Russia is not represented in the novel directly, except for the fact maybe that when the main character was in the military service in Germany, his dog was called Ivan. So the reference to the Russian literature may be considered as non-plot related element. And these references, being non-plot related, attract attention because they are unexpected. Non-plot related elements are the descriptions, auctorial digressions, inserted episodes that are not part of the plot. The main objective of such elements is to expand the borders of the represented material and to enable the author to express his or her thoughts and feelings on the aspects of life which are not directly related to the plot. Here, in this report,
Natalia Nikolaevna, I'm sorry, we are running out of the time.
The time is up?
It's up. It's nearly up. Yeah, please.
Maybe let's go to the end of the report and make a conclusion. In conclusion of my report, I'd like to quote Malcolm Donald's opinion on the role of writers in the development of cognitive psychology. The best writers have published the subjective exploration of the mind much further than would be permissible in clinical or experimental psychology. Novelists, in particular, often explore our deepest assumptions about awareness. Their portrayals of it constitute a vast, unsystematic collection of phenomena observed from the inside, and are possibly the most authoritative descriptions we have. And Anna Wierzbicka catches the idea and develops it, noting that what is characteristic to the best novelist is also applicable to the best biography authors. And if we want to penetrate the process of thinking and the emotional world of people who are bilingual, people who overcome the borders of languages and cultures, it would be foolish to ignore the thing Donald called the most authoritative descriptions. We can't but agree that using this authoritative evidence of people that have the real basis for comparing two types of the inner experience, we can learn a lot about the nature of connections between the inner experience of a person and the language. The analyzed piece, the analyzed material demonstrates the main ways to objectify in the language the self-identification of a person related or belonging to two cultures. It also clarifies the role of non-plot related elements in extending the dialogue of texts in the great time. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Colleagues, please, any remarks or questions? If you have. Joseph, yes, please.
Just, I'm not really a fan of Angela's Ashes, and I never read Tis, but very interesting that the Irish Americans were so clannish, so sticking together. Colm Tobin's Brooklyn, which I haven't read, but I've seen the movie, is the opposite, where the girl is drawn back to Ireland, but she has married her Italian lover in New York. So in the end, she goes back to New York, and she breaks out of this centripetal Irish absorption. But I like, better than Frank McCourt, I like John McCourt, The Years of Bloom. It's an absolutely wonderful book. It's one of the best books I ever read about Joyce, and it reads like a novel. You're really inside Joyce's life during those very important years.
Jerome McCourt, it's just a namesake of Frank McCourt.
No, his brother, John McCourt. Frank McCourt's brother.
Well, I know the McCourt brothers, Malachi McCourt, who wrote Malachi McCourt, History of Ireland, Then there is Melody McCourt, who once ran for the government of New York City from the Green Party, I guess it's Melody McCourt. Then there are, then there were, yes, there are four McCourt brothers. Yes, I need to look it up.
I can check, we can check. There's no wiki entry on John McCourt.
There is only a wiki on Frank McCourt where all his brothers are mentioned.
Okay, well,
yes. Well, and the title, excuse me, the title of the novel once again?
Column Brooklyn, no?
Well, if you could write it in the chat, I would appreciate it very much.
Okay, I'll do that in a second. First, I'm looking at Frank McCourt on Wiki.
Okay. Thank you, Joseph. Any other comments, remarks, or questions, please?
I think it was really interesting and very deep research. And what was especially interesting for me is these parallels with linguistic authors and linguistic analysis. So we will expect your article then.
Looking forward, yeah, looking forward to it, of course.
Thank you very much.
Okay, okay, colleagues. Any other, please?
Comments, I would be very grateful, and look them up in the chat.
What's this now?
Now, colleagues, we have.
Николаевна, отключите, пожалуйста, ваш экран.
Yes.
Я сейчас, я должна что отключить? Да. Да, все убрала. Никак не могу.
Вверху меню зума.
Сейчас.
Остановить демонстрацию. Ну, сейчас я сделаю. Все, я сделала.
Okay.
Спасибо.
Thank you, colleagues. Now I need to announce we have an interval. We have an interval till 3 o'clock, and then we have the second daytime session.